welcome to one, to all, whoever tunes in for this tonight. I gather there's some things going on the real world that might have people distracted, and also, yeah, in our own group. I won't mention what's going on because that's not my place, but I would just say that our thoughts are with my good sister Nessie. As she's going through it today. So Nessie, I want to say that we love you and hope you're doing okay. Um, but yeah, but the show must go on, as they say. We are talking today about well, a show in a little franchise that is called Star Wars. Some of you may have heard of it. Um, Today is going to be interesting because I've had complicated feelings about this one, but we're going to talk through that. And so just wanted to say that up front because we're often a very, very enthusiastic channel, and for better or for worse, there will be some very enthusiastic things that I will talk about, and then there will be some things that I have to kind of work through. It's the hazard of doing a stream about something that's brand new versus just going through our old favorites. So that show today that we're talking about is The Acolyte, which has been airing for the past 8 weeks, and we are now talking about. We wanted to hold off talking about it until it was all done to kind of stay away from the outside noise of what was going on with the show. I was not in tune with social media for the show, so I think there was probably a lot of that horrible word discourse going on about the show. I was happily ignorant of most of it, so but we'll see. I'm gonna start with you, Jared, because I feel like I don't know entirely where you land on, but I gather it's for the most part pretty positive.
It is. I really enjoyed this show, The Acolyte. I do have also some complicated feelings about it, so it'll be interesting to talk those through. Everyone knows that I am very much a Star Wars fanatic. I love essentially everything we've gotten in both the live action and the animated realm, and this show is no exception to that. But I will be honest that there were elements of the show that I thought perhaps were not as didn't hit quite as much of the mark as I would have hoped because I was very excited when this was announced. That being said, I ended up finding it to be a fascinating show, a terrifically ambitious show, a flawed show in many respects, but also ultimately a very worthy installment in the Star Wars galaxy for many reasons, not least of which is, the creative pedigree behind it and the diverse talent both behind the camera and in front of the camera, but also just narratively, this was a Star Wars story that challenged me more than a lot of Star Wars stories do. But that doesn't, hurt me or cause me to want to step back from it. If for anything, it made me want to delve in deeper and figure out why it challenged me in certain respects. And I think rewatching the series this past week has actually given me more insight into that. And having now been able to go through and rewatch the entire series in close succession over the past 2 days, I think I can say that I like it more than I did watching it week to week. I do, and I will wean that like into the realm of love. I do love this show, but I do, as we'll get into, there were elements of it again that perhaps challenged me in ways that are not in line with some of the online discourse around the show, and I will give you a little preview of some of that terribleness, because some of it was what to be expected, with the isms and all that. There was also just a lot of lore discourse around the show, some of which is fair, some of which was incredibly stupid. But ultimately, the lore was fascinating. The story was fascinating. I think there are some outstanding performances and technical craft work here. And I find it all a very rich and complicated blend. But it will be fun to kind of delve into the elements of the why of it all and why the show ultimately worked for me, even if I had some, as I said, some struggles with it along the way.
Yeah, so I have a couple things that I just want to sort of clear away before we just dive into this. I don't like to start too much in the negative, and I don't even want to call it negative. This is a conversation about the show. So what I'll actually start off by saying is that there's so much about the show that I thought was amazing. I thought the performances were great. I thought it had a lot of interesting ideas, and we're going to talk about all that. Thematically, this is a very rich show. But having said that, there's some things that were stumbling blocks for me with it. And the first thing I'm going to talk about just real quick, and we can talk about it a bit more later on if we choose to. But this show, and this is not even strictly this show's fault because it's been a trend. But it does feel like, for me, it came to the breaking point with this show. And it's not, like I said, it's not just this show. It's not just the Star Wars shows. It's a trend on Disney Plus. The episodes are really short. Not all of them. Some of these went a little longer, still probably not long enough for my taste, but I don't know what's going on there, if it's a Disney thing where they say we would prefer, shorter episodes, because we have a lot of kids, watching. So maybe, shorter attention spans and whatnot. But it really came to a head for me with this show because this felt like a binge show. And the episode run times maybe would not have been that much of a deal for me if we were binging this show. If, we just got to go from one episode right to the next. A perfect example of this, I think, was with episodes 4 and 5. I just watched the two of those episodes last night together, and they felt like a whole hour of television that went really well together. So either this needed to be a binge show, or they needed to not be afraid to drop this show in chunks, because there's a thing that happens where, and I felt this with other shows, but especially with this show, which was a continuing narrative as opposed to, say, something like The Mandalorian, which is more episodic. Even though I have problems with the runtime on Mandalorian as well. But with something like this, it felt like you were watching just long enough to start to get invested, and then the credits roll. You need to be able to sit with a story long enough that you feel invested. What happens when episodes are so short is it just doesn't give you the time, and because I didn't feel invested each week, like with other shows, I might be tempted to watch the previous week's episode before the new one, just so I feel like there's more material there. I did that with The Bad Batch all the time, but shorter run times is, is just part of the animation game, so I'm more used to that. But with this, because I never felt like I had long enough, except for maybe the first week where they dropped 2 episodes, the rest of the time it just felt like there wasn't enough time each week for me to really get invested, and so I didn't feel compelled to do a rewatch the next week, and then that just sort of exasperated the problem, where this did not feel like a week-to-week show where you could do that. It felt like it's an ongoing story, and if it's not a binge, you just need to sit longer in the episodes to feel it. And I was going to say Andor, and I think it's probably no mistake that because that show was more aimed at adults, that they probably had more free reign to do longer run times. I think the shortest episodes of Andor were the first 3, which they dropped together. So yeah, but this is not about comparisons so much. Just it's a gripe that I have with Disney Plus shows, and it caused an issue with me here. That said, now let me move on to the good. I got to rewatch the whole show over the past couple days. I watched episodes 1 through 3 one night, 4 and 5 the next, and then today I rewatched the last 3 episodes, and I found it much more narratively engaging. I felt more connected to the story. So yeah, it's sort of, it's time for me to make some decisions. Maybe I need to change the way that I watch these shows. Maybe I make personal decisions for myself that are out of step with how Disney chooses to release the episodes. So yeah, so there's that, and you know what? I have a couple other things, but I want to save it because I don't want to unload all the sort of issues that I have right off the top, because there really is a lot to like about this show. Where do you want to start, Jared? Because there really is a lot, because this is a dense show. There's a lot going on.
There is, and that not just narratively, but thematically and interpersonal character dynamics as well. Just to kind of play off what you had mentioned about the run times. The run times didn't bother me quite as much, but what did kind of, I noticed, was that sometimes the episode endings did feel a little bit more abrupt, in the sense that like they just had to stop the episode at a certain point, to make sure it fit the 8 episode order. And I did feel that like this was probably the most serialized story, purely serialized story that we've had for one of the live action Disney Plus Star Wars shows. The runtime, as you said, it seems to be kind of a Disney mandate. Pretty much all of the MCU shows and Star Wars shows have had these episode lengths, with a few exceptions. As I said, Andor got to be 12 episodes and a little bit longer each episode. I think the show benefited from that. Andor was also something of an outlier. It was the most expensive Star Wars show. This one is the second most expensive, actually. And it is notable that as much as Andor is rightly lauded and beloved, it is the least watched of the Star Wars shows by a pretty significant margin. But so maybe that's why. I don't know. It does seem like it's kind of more of a corporate mandate, and I wish that wasn't the case for these kinds of episode lengths. But more, what I noticed was just this show was billed as, and this is kind of lead us into the story. This show was billed as something that was described as a mystery thriller. It was set up from the very beginning to be a detective story. I believe the log line of the show was a former Padawan reunites with her former master to solve a series of crimes, and that and then there was also an idea that this would be a story about emerging dark side powers, and that it would ultimately delve into the idea of what it would be, which is like to tell the show from a dark side perspective. And it wasn't clear to me originally what that would be, and I think that may have been some of what I struggled with initially with the show. Ultimately, I've come to a good place on it, but I think probably where we felt some of the friction was that this show was trying to tell a very ambitious story with mystery elements, but ultimately the mystery wasn't the point. The character drama was. Because one of the reasons we held off on discussing the show was that we were like, we don't want to get drawn into the theorizing every single week about the twists and turns of the mystery. Ultimately, I feel the mystery, while it all made very clear sense to me by the end, and thematically and narratively, it was not the most, like, and I'm glad the show didn't do this, it was not a shocking mystery. They did not put in shocking twists for the sake of shocking twists. For the most part, the elements of the story that were heavily foreshadowed came to pass, and the bigger mystery became the question of why the events happened, not the what. And that tends to be my preferred form of storytelling, but it is not necessarily what the show was billed as, you know? And so ultimately, I think that's where there may have been some disconnect, because, you know, we'll just say it, like, this show in the marketing, they tried very early on to kind of present it as, you know, the idea that there was this assassin who was hunting down Jedi, and until the very end, they kept the fact that that Amandla Stenberg was actually playing two characters, not one, out of the marketing materials, until the very end. And but whereas in the show, they confirm it within the first 20 minutes. I'm so glad they did that. But then there's the identity of the Darksider, which people were coming up with all kinds of crazy theories, and I'm like, I think I know who it is from the moment the guy shows up on screen, or even in the trailer, and then yes, it's that guy.
Well, it's funny that is actually one place where I was happy that I was staying away from all the noise, because I thought I had been so clever, and that the creators of the show had been so stupid, because I thought they screwed up with the credits of the first episode, and because Jodie Turner-Smith's name was in the credits for the first episode, but she didn't appear to be in it at all. So when when I watched the first episode, I was like, "Wow, she's the Sith." And then I was totally wrong about that. But it did feel like they were sort of dangling that, because even in episode 5, they have Osha say, "My mother could do that." Yeah. And so it felt like that was actually a possible red herring. So maybe they did that credit thing on purpose. But because I was staying away from all the noise, I didn't know one way or the other. Although I think I had heard somebody, I don't know if it was through Force Center or what, theorize about it being yeah. See, this is why I need a list of character names up in front of me. Who it ended up being. Yeah, oh God, I'm absolutely...
The villain, Chimera.
Yeah. There we go. Which at first I was like, oh, that's kind of weird for him to be the Sith master. But then, of course, and we'll talk about later on when we get to the very end, there's actually another element to that. But he ended up being, like, I feel like the MVP of the whole show. He was incredible. Yeah. In a way that I did not expect. And he's even like, that early stuff with him before his identity is revealed as the Sith master. like all his early stuff is so much funnier when you know he actually is. It's like it's funny to actually, you know, really have a lot of affection for a Sith. Like we've had Sith that are fun to watch, you know, Palpatine himself, of course, but I felt like this was something different where it's like I sort of have this own theory that I'm actually not sure which version of Crimea is actually more him. If he actually is really naturally more klutzy and like to be, you know, the Sith, he has to be more assertive, or if that's his natural state and he was putting on the clumsiness, because there is, when he's still pretending, he like fumbles some of his words, and I'm like, that's not something you would do if you're actually super crafty. uh, so I just like what he did with the character. Definitely one of the big high points of the show, I feel.
Yes.
But yeah, no, he's great.
Yeah, I think it's probably the consensus generally around the internet that in many respects, when it came to the Acolyte, Manny Jacinto as Chimere / the Stranger stole the show. He was great in this role, and a very unique Sith character for Star Wars. And as you say, people are, you know, he had a certain appeal about him that the internet has very much latched onto, namely his biceps. But there is so much more to the character and to the performance of this in both of his roles, because as Eric points out in the chat, you know, Manny Jacinto, he's kind of been a working character actor. Most people were most familiar with him from his role on the NBC series The Good Place, where he played a very bumbling character.
That is him, isn't it? I've seen a little bit of it, but I've never seen the whole thing. Now I feel like I really want to go watch The Good Place, as if I don't have enough to watch.
Yes, yes, but it was, you know, that was a very comedic role because, you know, light spoilers, he starts off in that show playing, he presents himself as a very serene, you know, Buddhist monk-like figure, and then it's quickly revealed that no, actually he's a stumbling, klutzy, you know, idiot, basically a well-meaning idiot in many ways, but he's hilarious in that. And that Leslye Headland, the creator of the show, has been very upfront that she wanted Manny Jacinto for this role specifically. She had also seen him in another show whose name is escaping me at the moment, but she was impressed by his, you know, ability to play comedy, but also his ability to reveal intensity. 9 Perfect Strangers was the show she saw him on. And you can see that in this role because starting out as Chimere, he almost functions in a way kind of like Yoda in The Empire Strikes Back. He presents himself as a low-status character as a way to...
I wasn't even picking up on the Yoda parallel, and really that's on the rewatch. This is what I found most interesting about this show, was that it really inverts so much of what we're used to in a Star Wars story. And I think that may have been what kept me really at distance on my first week-to-week viewing, because I didn't understand what the show was doing. But now just, you know, and I did see some of your posts in the Force Center Discord about your uncomfortability with the iconography at the you know end of the show. But I think really that's part of the point, is that this is a Star Wars story, you know, showing the formation of a Sith apprentice or acolyte, and the show is sort of being from that Sith point of view, in a way that I feel like is probably designed to make us feel uncomfortable, but that doesn't change the fact that it makes us feel uncomfortable.
Yes. and that I give the show immense credit for that, because that is by design. Leslye Headland has talked about the fact that in this era, this show is set at the end of what's called the High Republic era, 100 years before the events of the Phantom Menace. And in this era, the Jedi are the dominant, institution in the galaxy alongside the Republic, and the Sith, who have been in hiding for 900 years at this point, are very much the underdogs. They cannot challenge the Jedi openly. There are far too many of them. They have not established themselves as they eventually will in the prequel era. So it becomes the idea of how do the Sith start to work the levers of power to gain a foothold that will eventually allow them to, as Vernestra says, tip the scales. And we see a lot of those seeds in the show that lead directly into the prequels, and I thought that was actually executed very, very well. And I think that some of those twists are part of, the inevitability of them is what gave them their power rather than their surprise factor. Leslye Headland had a great quote in an interview that I fully agree with, when she was talking about the nature of the twists and the mystery she was setting up. And she said, quote, "I think a good twist is not about hiding everything from the audience and then throwing it on them like, hey, this is what you didn't see. We hit it so well that you didn't see this. I think a good twist is telegraphing what's going to happen, and then once it does, executing it without an ounce of pity or sentimentality." And I think that is a great quote, and I fully endorse that perspective, because I think that's a lot of what made some of the twists in things like other shows that we love, like Game of Thrones, feel so incredibly well earned. The Red Wedding is widely considered, a brilliant twist, because when you go back and look at the pieces, you can see every step that led toward the doom of Robb Stark.
Going off topic for a second, it's sort of sick having read the books prior to watching the show, because to what everybody else is this, shocking twist. Oh my God, I can't believe that happened, was so sickeningly obvious watching if you already know what's going to happen. It's like, because once you know what's going to happen, like, all the cards are there on the table, and it's just dread inducing just watching, especially with the way they made it in the show, that made Robb seem to be making more proactive steps to move against Tywin after the wedding's over, and you're just sitting there watching, you're like, oh God. Like, you're screwed. How can you not see that you're screwed? But yeah, so that is like just, yeah. And sometimes, like, yeah, those kind of twists and stuff, the really great ones are good even if you know what's coming.
Yeah.
Like, even if you somehow crack the code and you figure it out, it's the manner of its execution that still makes it dramatically compelling. And I think that's why, like, we start to get ideas of not exactly what happened on Brendock, but you can see it on Sol's face that he did something terrible.
Yes.
And so something terrible has happened, but it's exactly what and how it happened that it is just so. And that's what's so great about episode 7 is, I like to call it the episode where everybody makes really, really bad, poor decisions.
Yes.
Yeah, no. And speaking of which, I will say that when watching this show on the air, my two favorite episodes were definitely episodes 3 and episode 7. And I think part of that is because those two episodes do actually function well as standalone episodes, not in the fact that everything is, because certainly there were loose ends in episode 3 that aren't resolved until episode 7, but it wasn't part of, it was separate from the rest of the ongoing narrative. to where episode 3 was like its own piece in the middle of this ongoing. That was still very much connected to the story, but it had to resolve somewhat within its runtime. And so for me, that's what made those episodes work so well. And now going back and rewatching the whole thing, they're like these almost breathers in between the rest of the narrative, but they're some of the most intense and sort of sad breathers imaginable. But it's still like, I would say that's still some of my favorite stuff in the whole show, is just the whole story on Brendock and how tragic it all is.
Yeah, and how well-meaning actions can sometimes have terrible consequences when it's founded on just a simple misunderstanding that spirals and escalates. And I think that the show did that extremely well. And as we said, executing the twists, such as they were, without an ounce of pity or sentimentality, that is what made them so effective. Bringing it back to Chimere for a moment, like I said, when it was announced that he was the one character who wasn't really like a force-sensitive, Jedi character in the lead up to the show, my mind immediately pinged, and I'm like, he's going to be the secret Sith Lord. And then it was more confirmed when we saw it in the trailer, and he starts quoting the line, the Jedi just justify their galactic dominance in the name of peace, but peace is a lie, which is, of course, the first line of the Sith code. Peace is a lie, there is only passion. Which we don't get that last part, but we did get to start to see it towards the end of the show. And in particular, but knowing that he was probably the Sith Lord, I wanted him to be the Sith Lord, because I knew that, it makes sense for his character to be presenting himself alongside May in the early stages as we said, kind of in a Yoda-like ruse of presenting himself as low status so that he can keep an eye on his would-be acolyte. But there is a reason that when he has to reveal himself to the Jedi and starts to take them down, and we get the shot that ultimately, once his helmet comes off, and the absolutely brutal shot where he murders a beloved character, and as she falls to the ground, we finally see his face, and he is completely transformed. Gone is the bumbling, awkward, kind of low life, former smuggler, and in his place is a ruthless, terrifying killer with an intensity and a forthrightness that is chilling to watch. It's an incredibly effective reveal. And then we get to see yet another side of his character later on, once he starts to have a softer edge with Osha, but perhaps I feel there is still an undercurrent of manipulation going on there. And then there's the very real pain that he probably felt, but the question, like when he was betrayed and discarded, as he says, but the question is, what do you do with that pain? And I think that ultimately one of the things that I struggled with the show, but ultimately think it's to the show's credit, is that when they're telling a story from the dark side perspective, it isn't, and the Darksiders are the underdogs in many respects. Well, what does that code us? It codes the audience to root for those characters. And I think that that's where I had some of my issues, because ultimately something that's very core to my understanding of the Star Wars and like the true north is the idea that of what I call the lie of the dark side. The idea that the dark side is, natural, it's present in everyone, but the idea is that it's exactly as Yoda says in The Empire Strikes Back. What is the dark? Is the dark side stronger? No. Quicker, easier, more seductive. And the idea that if you give into these strong feelings that Chimere talks about, anger, fear, loss, desire, and allow them to rule you, you will gain quick access to power. But ultimately the only way you can maintain that power is to live in those feelings, in that hurt, in that pain, in that loss forever. And it traps you in that way. And that is why, the Jedi path often is the, while it's the harder path to walk, it takes more discipline. It ultimately is the one on the side of right in Star Wars. And I think where I got uncomfortable was where I felt the show was leaning a little bit too much onto the seductive aspect to show us how its appeal. But what I didn't want was for the show to ultimately say the dark side characters are right, because I don't feel that is what the show ultimately did, because I do ultimately see the show as a tragedy, and that is why it works.
Yeah, it's, for me, like I'm right there with you, and it's why I struggled initially. But the more I've thought about it, I feel there's great power in showing just how seductive the dark side can be, and by placing, to make us root in a way for that, and make us sympathetic to, we can still step back and objectively see that, he's manipulating her, and and that this is not a path she should go down. But it's very clear, like, but emotionally you can feel what she feels, and you can see, you can sympathize with that part of her that wants to go that way. And I think it was very crafty for Leslye Headland to go in this direction for depicting this, because it I'm trying to think of a way to word this, because ever since Star Wars first came out, we've gotten very comfortable in the position of being able to view the Sith very objectively, as they are, uh, the baddies. They're coded as baddies. There's never any uh, doubt of that. There's, but in a true examination of evil, um, the reality of the world is that there are different perspectives, different points of view, as Obi-Wan would say, and evil never believes that it's, well, I won't say never, but very often evil does not believe that it's evil. They're the ones those who are evil believe themselves to be victims, and to have been the ones who have been wronged. In some cases they have, but they're the righteous ones. And I think this show is attempting to get at the Sith through that lens. And it's different. It's uncomfortable. But especially on a rewatch, I was like, no, I see what you're doing here. And I think in some ways this is the most compelling fall to darkness that we've ever seen, strictly because it ends on a note of sort of rooting for Oshi, or Osha, because she was wronged. And even though, I don't walk away with feeling that that Soul is a bad guy or villain. I think he made some really bad mistakes, but at the same time, even though I have, a very conflicted feelings about him, for Osha, yes, objectively, I look at her and I'm like, you're making wrong decisions here, but also I get why you're doing it. And my heart goes out to you, and I sympathize with your choices. And that's a very, and to be in that character, in with that character in their feelings as they turn to the dark side. I don't know that it's ever been done in that way. Because with Anakin, with his fall to the dark side, especially with the Clone Wars, we can see how that happens bit by bit. But I feel like we're still a bit on the outside watching someone fall, and we're like, no, don't do it, don't do it, don't do it. This feels different because this feels like we're on the inside emotionally. We're seeing how she makes these decisions, and all I can say is I hope she finds her way out of it in a season 2, because my heart just breaks for her.
Yeah, I found Osha's fall to be extremely affected, also because of that sense of tragic inevitability to it, and the pain that lies at the heart of Osha and May, the loss that they suffered, the kind of the web of lies they needed to untangle. It is incredibly understandable and relatable that they would feel the way that they do by the end. And I feel that that was one of the show's strengths. It's also, the other side of the coin there is that, like, the Jedi are in this show really, they're deeply flawed. And they always were that, especially as the overall institution of the Jedi Order. But we haven't seen it quite to this extent, where essentially by the end, there are no purely morally upright Jedi left. We had thought Soul might end up being a Qui-Gon type figure, and he has elements of that, but ultimately in the end he is a deeply, deeply flawed man. And he, compassionate and brave as he was, he ultimately had a mistake, a sin that he wouldn't own up to, and it cost him everything. And then, the more institutionalized figures like Vernestra really kind of end up perpetuating the cycle by, recognizing that there was a lie at the heart of this tragedy, and then, trying to do damage control on that by effectively another lie, by a cover-up. And we knew that tragedy had to happen because of the idea that the Jedi couldn't really fully discover the Sith were out there, in publicly at least, until the events of the Phantom Menace. But it means that we have to watch this institution that we hold in such high regard, stumble quite badly. As Vernestra says at the end of the final episode to May, the Jedi have failed you. And in many respects, that was another element where I became a little bit frustrated with the show, even though I think the show handled it with more nuance than the discussions around it, because there is almost a hunger in certain elements of the Star Wars fandom to, raise it up, the idea that, the Jedi are actually the bad guys, right? That the Jedi are like, they're terrible. That this was a strain of discourse that really kind of started to infect the things around the time of The Last Jedi, where people were really focused on the idea that the Jedi Order was flawed and perhaps it should end. And a lot of people still feel that way and lifted up that movie as a sign of it. And I've always strongly felt that if that's the message you get from watching The Last Jedi, then you forgot to watch the last third of the movie, because ultimately it reaffirms everything about the Jedi.
It's the discourse surrounding The Last Jedi was so frustrating from virtually every side.
Yes.
I hate those misreadings of the movie. Whatever your issues with individual elements, if or a championing of elements, because we'll have that discussion when we do our Last Jedi talk. But some of the most fervent supporters of that movie were just as frustrating as people who hated it because they took away the wrong things from it. And yeah, so boy, that'll be a vent-filled stream when we get to it.
It will, because I'm generally pretty happy and go lucky, and I want to embrace all perspectives and opinions, even if it's like somebody doesn't love a movie as much as I do, or vice versa. I have very few red lines when it comes to Star Wars discourse. One of them is the idea that if you watch The Last Jedi and come away from it in any way, no matter how much you love or hate it, believing that the message of the movie is, quote, let the past die, end quote, then you need to, stop what you're doing, go watch everything past the throne room scene, because you completely and utterly fail to understand.
Okay, all right, this is just the digression part of the stream, because I have to express my anger with every time I saw a complaint about The Last Jedi in terms of like how which I didn't always agree with either. I didn't always agree with the complaints being thrown out, like, this flies in the face of what Star Wars is about. This type of humor doesn't fit, or whatever have you, which, whether I agreed with them or not, people are allowed to have complaints about the movie. But then the comeback from the, like, ultra positive Last Jedi, brigade was, any complaints that somebody had about how it didn't line up with like their desire for, what Star Wars was, their comeback refrain was always, let the past die. Let the past die. Like that was their ultimate defense of the movie. And it's like, no.
The movie believes almost the opposite, and The Rise of Skywalker ultimately reaffirms the message of The Last Jedi from the final third. We will get to that, but that is the reason I love that movie so much, and I love The Last Jedi as well.
We'll get to that, to work our way back to this. Yeah, Qui-Gon, Guilty Undertaker is right. He had a selflessness and not only, willingness to give himself over to the will of the Force, but the living Force as well. Yes. Qui-Gon was Qui-Gon. There's never gonna be another Qui-Gon. Still, like, I think one of the most compelling things about a rewatch was that the knowledge of what Saul did and what happens in those final episodes did not change his virtues watching earlier in the show, and so that drove home to me that this was not, someone who's masquerading as a virtuous Jedi Knight. Maybe a little bit, but he had good qualities. But he did something terrible and he didn't own up to it, and he had plenty of opportunity to do so. And that's what this story ultimately. The story was about flawed individuals. Yes. Who make tragically bad decisions, and I think, and again, that's part of what makes it an uncomfortable story, I think, for some of us. And this is also where we get into a conversation about, expectations of something you're going to watch versus what's actually there. I think a lot of people, myself included, expected to come into a High Republic story, seeing the Jedi in their prime, without this sort of, without the fall from grace that we get in the prequel era. But of course, this takes place towards the end of the High Republic era, and so this is actually a story about that transition into the age of the prequels. And therefore, the story of the fall of the Jedi is inherent to it. But that's not what I thought I was getting. So this is where I really have to put my money where my mouth is, because I always talk about, you know, sort of dealing with what you're presented rather than what you wanted to get. And I'm almost always able to do that. Sometimes it's a bit of a struggle, and this may have been one of those times. The show was not at all what I expected, especially not from back when it was originally announced. I had like a completely different idea of what the show was going to be. But and that's why a rewatch is always incredibly valuable, because that's when you're watching what the thing actually is and not what you were expecting. And even though I still have, issues, we've been talking about some of them, like, I really appreciate just all that this show did so well. Like, we haven't even talked about how gorgeous this show is. The look of the show, the costume design, the choreography. We haven't mentioned yet how freaking amazing the lightsaber battles in this show are. They are like some of the best we've ever gotten. I don't think there was talk about trying to like best, the prequels and like Duel of the Fates and stuff. I don't think they didn't get to Duel of the Fates level, but still, I think there's some of the more impressive lightsaber battles that we've seen, in a while. And especially the fights between Soul and Chimere. I thought they were just out of this world amazing.
Yeah. The choreography is outstanding. I agree, it did not match Duel of the Fates or Battle of the Heroes, or even some of the other duels from the original trilogy or prequel or sequel trilogy for me, but there were some great ones. And the one on Kofar at night in the forest and the one in the finale are, they stand tall for me as an incredibly impressive feats of action, direction, and one name to shout out on that front is Christopher Cowan. He was the kind of the action choreographer director for a lot of those fights, and Leslye Headland really kind of let him take a lot of ownership and guiding during those sequences.
When in this last fight, when there was some really cool late sort of flying through the air stuff, that like there was so much of the show that very much reminded me of like sort of Crouching Tiger, Hidden Dragon, that flavor of stuff, especially in the first couple episodes, and then with this fight and stuff. It added a flavor to the show that I thought was really a lot of fun and unique.
Yeah, and Leslye Headland has been very upfront that Crouching Tiger, Hidden Dragon was a direct inspiration for many of these sequences. She also talked about Kill Bill and Frozen as well in terms of the style and the tone of the show, but Crouching Tiger, Hidden Dragon was very much kind of the North Star for those kinds of action sequences. Yes, and I think that this show had certain elements that felt almost deliberately stylized, because we've never quite seen Jedi, fighting in this way in unarmed combat. But it makes narrative sense, because in this era they are, so like they are so established and so, clearly like the most dominant force in the galaxy, not because they want to dominate others, but because no one can challenge them in their power, that they don't need to pull their lightsabers out very often. The Sith are gone for all intents and purposes, and that's one of the reasons why their reemergence becomes such a shocking development here. But going back to what you were saying earlier about the idea of engaging with the story as presented to you, like that is really a North Star for me as well. The idea that, as our friends at Force Center say, engage with the story as presented to you, not the story you wish you were being told. And in many respects, I always try to live that, whenever I engage with any piece of media. That doesn't mean that it's unfair to not have hopes or fears or want certain things from the show. It just means you have to kind of recognize that if things don't go that way, ask yourself why, and not just rage that the show made a mistake.
Well, and this is where I always get a lot of flack because I sort of live my, cinema and television life by two rules. Oh, hold on a second. I'm getting a little blurry. Let me fix that. It's one, what we've been talking about, the, engage with the story as presented, not, not either what you thought you were getting or what you wish you were getting. And also the fact that if I don't like something, I tend not to talk about it much.
Yeah.
And I instead focus on things I did like, or move on to something that I like more. And I think those two things always make me very frustrated for some people. But that does not mean never be critical of something. I always use the example of, again, going back to, as I've said, I think I referenced this just a week or two ago, but like the Hobbit films, I think there are people who just say, well, it wasn't like the book, throw our hands up. I don't do that. I very much engage with what we were given, which was not strictly the book. It was more than the book. It was part of the Hobbit book, part appendices, part, Peter Jackson being crazy Peter Jackson. And there's some things that I love about them, but there's also some things that I have, strong issues with. And I don't shy away from that. I still have a lot of affection for them, but there's nonetheless issues. So yeah, all that stuff doesn't mean that I'm just never considering any criticism of something. But I do think you have to come to things in good faith.
Yeah, and that is ultimately what I think this show did in its, in being honest with and upfront with how it is, treating its characters, its heroes, its villains, and the kind of the complicated, intersections between them. And I will own that, one of the things I do love much about Star Wars is the fact that is at its heart, often is a morality tale. And George Lucas, that was kind of a North Star for him. And the light side of the characters who follow the light side of the Force, they may be tremendously flawed, but ultimately I believe that they are, the side of the good side, the side of right. And the characters who give into selfishness and fear and greed and anger and rage and inflict pain on the others, as the dark side does, they're the villains of the story. And for a show that was kind of inverting the power dynamic between those two sides, where the dark siders are kind of the underdog trying to undermine the institution of the Jedi, I knew going into it that ultimately the dark siders would manage to kind of take the Jedi down a peg. But I will also own that when that happened and I started to see just how deeply flawed some of the Jedi were, I found myself hoping for more of a direct beacon of light. And for a lot of the show, that was Soul and that was Osha. And ultimately the tragedy of the show, but part of its narrative brilliance, is that their Soul and Osha had such tremendous affection for each other, but there was a central lie. There was that at the heart of it, a rot that ultimately destroyed everything and led to, one character falling into darkness and killing, the man she once thought of as her father and her savior. And I think that it's an incredibly ambitious story to tell, but it means that, you know, two characters that became very, like, that were kind of our paragons on the light side, you know, they fall. Other characters who were, you know, light side coded characters like Jeckie and Yord, you know, they die halfway through the series. And a character like May, you know, kind of starts to come back to the light a little bit, but she also, you know, she doesn't get all the way there, and then ultimately she, you know, makes a sacrifice that results in her memory being erased. And then Vernestra, you know, kind of as our authority figure, she ends up covering this up for like greater good. And so I found myself like kind of hoping for a more of a beacon of light in a story that I knew would ultimately be dark.
Well, we do end with Yoda.
Yes, we do.
So he's our beacon of hope.
Yes, but even Yoda himself can be a flawed and fascinating character. You know, he talks like, you know, we see in the Clone Wars, for instance. You know, once they learn about the clone army potentially having, you know, these chips inside them that could be, you know, and were commissioned by the Sith, he helps, you know, cover that up because they're trying to focus on the war effort. And Yoda himself admits that he has failed in many respects by the end of the prequel trilogy, and ultimately the great power is that he manages to pass those lessons on to Luke, both in the original trilogy and in the sequel trilogy. And that is a testament of the characters, you know, being flawed, making mistakes, but ultimately learning from them and still being able to be that beacon of hope. That's one of the things I find so powerful about Luke's journey in the sequel trilogy, for instance, all the way through to the end. But where it ended up feeling kind of, you know, extra dark for me was the idea that even after Soul, you know, confessed to May, you know, that what he had done in a moment of weakness and fear, slaying their mother, Anastasia, he still was insisting that he had done the right thing by, you know, and the moment I heard that, him say that, my heart kind of sank a little bit, just because you know, for Soul to admit, you know, what he had done and kind of ask for forgiveness or atonement, that could have been a triumph for him. But ultimately, it's the fact that he can't get all the way there that leads to the moment where the truth does come out, as it always does, at the worst possible time and in the worst possible way. And it causes this young woman, Osha, who loved Soul and looked up to him, you know, it causes her to snap and to kill him and to cement her journey towards the dark side.
I think, and that for me is what makes Soul's story of, you know, his flaws, you know, you know, so much different from when talking about a character like, you know, Yoda. Yoda certainly made his mistakes, but he, you know, always had a sort of North Star of knowing what the right thing to do was. And, you know, Soul makes, and certainly I don't think Yoda ever did, that we know about, something as dark as what Soul did. Soul is unable to come to terms with what he's done. Like, he feels guilt and remorse about it, but he's unable to, like, fully accept that he just needs to ask for forgiveness, that there is nothing that could justify what he did. And he clings to this idea that, well, if I can just, you know, prove, you know, that we were right about this, you know, vergence in the Force, like, it'll make it all worth it. But there's nothing that could make, you know, that worth it. And I think he's not able to accept that. And that ultimately is sort of the tragedy of his character. And like you know, and it leads to his undoing. I think if he turned to Osha in that moment and just apologized, you know, with, you know, full humility, um, you know, he may have walked away in that moment, but because he's still about, you know, the fact that he actually says the words, it was the right thing to do. It's like, what are you doing, man? It's, you need to accept in your heart that you made a mistake, and that there is no justification for that. It's the moment when I like Soul the least, like where I, you know, and where I have the most problems with his character, which is not, I'm not, that's not necessarily a criticism of his character or his character arc or the writing or anything like that. I think that's very intentional, but it's like it signs his death warrant in that moment, and it's sad to see, because this is a man who you can tell he does feel great remorse for what he did, but he is trying to find a way to live with what he did instead of just acknowledging that you make mistakes and sometimes there is no good reason that you can point to and to try and, you know, justify something you've done. Sometimes the thing is done and you just have to own up to it. And unfortunately, he doesn't accept that in his heart. And you know, the one good thing is that in that moment before his death, he does say to Osha, "It's all right." You know, I think he realizes his mistake, and he doesn't want Osha to feel, you know, any kind of, you know, guilt about what she's done there or anything. So yeah, I do feel like they have there's a moment of acceptance on his part, but unfortunately for him, it comes too late.
Yeah, and the thing about that is that it's a moment of acceptance, but it's not it's not really a moment of true repentance. You know, we've talked a lot about I certainly have when we talked about Star Wars stories, both when we discussed the prequels and the Bad Batch, about what the idea of redemption in Star Wars truly means, and that it's not that, as I've said, you know you do a terrible thing or many terrible things, and then you do one good thing, and all of your past crimes are forgiven. Um, but it's the idea that no matter what you've done, no matter what terrible choices you've made, it is never too late to make a better choice. And then accept, you know, the consequences that may come. That is the reason that Anakin's redemption is so incredibly moving and powerful. Why Ben Solo's redemption is moving and powerful. Why Crosshair's arc across the Bad Batch is so incredibly moving and powerful. And where the tragedy of Soul is that he doesn't, you know, he wants to make that better choice. He tries to tell Osha, you know, many times throughout the course of the show what had happened. But ultimately it was either bad circumstances or bad timing, or also just fear, you know, because to face down this young woman who he has loved essentially as a daughter and as his apprentice for 16 years, and tell her that he is in many respects the source of all of her pain and trauma because of a mistake he made, based on a misunderstanding, you know, he's terrified to face that moment. It is his single greatest fear, and it ultimately results in him not revealing it until he is almost, you know, it almost not tricked, but like he can't he doesn't realize that Osha. It's very telling that he doesn't realize that Osha is there when he admits his crime to May, who knows what he had done. But as Vernestra kind of says, you know, aptly, you know, Soul in many respects justified everything he had done by his selfish love for Osha, like the selfish love ultimately that he had for Osha. And that's why I think it's a very telling and very poignant and tragic that one of the last things he's trying to say to her before, you know, before she starts to force choke him, is he says the line, "I did it all because I love." and you know he's going to say because I loved you. And it's one of my favorite moments in the series, even though it's one of the most darkest, because you understand, like, for Osha to be hearing that in that moment is unfortunately the last thing she needs to hear. And that's why one of my favorite moments of acting in the entire show is when Amandla Stenberg as Osha starts to force choke Soul, and she just says these two words with absolute torrents of pain behind them. Stop talking. And the way that she, and you can feel why she would say that to that moment, because everything that Soul is coming out of Soul's mouth in that moment, none of it is what she needs to hear, which is, I'm sorry. And ultimately it means that she decides that, like, in an impulsive moment of passion in many ways, you know, to end his life, this man who she had loved, you know, for 16 years and looked up to and idolized. But the betrayal is so great in that moment. It's so much to overcome. And it's why it is ultimately the moment that sends her down the path to the dark side and leads to all of her rage being poured into the crystal and bleeding it and turning it, you know, Sith red. And I just found it to be a very effective moment of, you know, her dark side turn, all the more so because of the ideas that we'll get into when, you know, the way these episodes were often paired and the duality of the titles, the idea of destiny and choice, and how in many respects, you know, Osha's choice was taken from her by Soul, you know, who believed it was his destiny to train this girl, but also when Osha has a vision of Soul being killed in this way, and she thinks it's May that's doing it, and she decides she's going to make the choice to try and save him. And then when she finds herself in that position, she makes a choice to, you know, fulfill that vision and end his life herself. You know, she was seeing herself there. But where I find it tragic is that it ultimately is not the emotional catharsis and release that she truly needed. And one of the incredible tragedies of it is after she's done this and after she falls to her knees and she's crying and Kymir comes over to her and tries to, you know, give her a little, like, you know, touch her shoulder with affection, and she leaps up and, like, points the lightsaber at him, and then she realizes with horror that the lightsaber has been bled and it's now turning red, the color of the Sith, the color of the dark side. And I think in many ways I feel like that is the moment where Osha almost surrenders to the idea that she was destined for darkness. And it's so heartbreaking right now. But it's phenomenal acting from Amandla Stenberg, who I feel like we haven't talked about enough, and I do want to rectify that because I love her in this role, both roles. But yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, were to even God, it's so funny because I remember back to yeah, I hadn't discovered this until after I watched the first two episodes that she was young Rue in the Hunger Games.
Yes.
So I was just thinking, oh God, she's just this, you know, little girl who made me sob, you know, in you know, in that movie. And I was so blown away by her performance in this. Just, you know, even leaving aside the fact that she was playing dual roles, just I thought she just did such a phenomenal job, and yeah, it broke my heart in that final episode. Just like I said, you're emotionally there with her, like you know, it's like intellectually you're like, don't do what you're doing, but at the same time emotionally, like, what else was she gonna do? She's in so much pain, you know. And it's just, oh God.
Yeah.
And you know, and she gets put through the ringer throughout this entire show. Which also like that's I love the sleight of hand in the first episode where it, cuts from from May, uh, killing, you know, uh, killing Andara, and then cut straight to Osha waking up in bed, and you're like, and you real, I mean, if I had no reason to suspect that she was playing two different parts, then I wouldn't have even considered it. But you devil, you had communicated that theory to me prior to the show, and so I had that in my head, and and so I was kind of onto her from that moment. But if I had known that was a theory going into the show, then I would have just been like, no, she totally killed her. But yeah, no, it's she did such a great job. One and I want to kind of segue a little bit here because one of my favorite uh, relationships that her character had is with someone who we haven't talked about yet, and I'm just chomping at the bit. And that was Jackie.
Yeah.
Played by the absolutely amazing Dafne Keen,
Yes.
who of course many of us, first saw in Logan, and so for me, it's always like, yes, X-23 is a Jedi. Yeah, no, I just, I love their relationship, and I love the fact that, after I presented it as my own personal, headcanon in the Slack, and then somebody said to me, no, that's actually been confirmed that they were playing it that way. The fact that there's a little, spark between the two of them, and I was so happy that I wasn't just like imagining that, because it did feel like that's the way it was being played, and it just makes it so sad, especially like later on down the line when, uh, when Chimere says to, her, where did you think that was going to go? Why do you only love people who can't love you back? And I was like, oh shit, that, and yeah, no, so it's funny that at the time I was just watching that thinking, oh, another tragic Jedi love story that cannot be, and then of course poor Jackie, meets her end in episode 5, which broke my heart, because you don't bring Dafne Keen into Star Wars and then and then kill her off. I am not cool with that. But I will say she delivered some freaking killer moves before she got dispatched. Her fight with Chimere was just amazing. And yeah, no, I just loved her whole character design. I love the way she played the character, and the fact that she was just the, young, fresh, Padawan of Soul. She did not deserve to meet her in that way, and so yeah, one of my favorite parts of the show, and I'm just really sad that she had to die, but like it was inevitable. Like all these people had to die, otherwise the truth would have come out. So in retrospect, I know it had to happen, but I was very upset that it did. But yeah, I love the way her and Osha, played off of each other. It was very obvious that Jackie had a crush.
Oh yes, which Dafne Keen has confirmed that she played it that way, and I love that they worked that little element into it, because yes, Jedi aren't supposed to have romantic attachments, but they do have feelings, and I found that it was very effective that Osha and Jackie, the current the former and now current Padawan of Soul, they could have had more of a rivalry dynamic, but instead they formed a very quick connection. You know, from the moment Osha meets Jackie on the ship in episode 2, she almost starts flirting with her when she's talking about like how flexible she can be. And you know, Jackie, you know, she's a little bit younger. I think she's meant to be 18 in the show, but like you can tell she's a little like, you know, she's impressed. She's impressed. And I like that they hinted at those dynamics further in episode 4, and that, you know, well, it doesn't ultimately blossom into like a full-on like love story because it gets tragically cut short. I think that that was intentional to give us that moment of hope and connection, because it's one of the things that endears us to us about both characters, especially Osha, because one of the reasons her fall is ultimately so devastating is because we see her in the beginning and we see what a kind, empathetic, you know, like character she is, you know, and like how like the fun that she has, the way she cracks a smile, it's all masking a deep reservoir of pain, but she is very much, you know, like a character who feels like she's on the light side of the force. And the dynamic that she has with Jackie is where we get some of the best moments of that, especially their conversations in episode 4, where, for instance, where Osha is starting to open up her connection to the Force again and feeling guilty after, you know, disturbing the Umbra Moth and getting it killed. And Jackie immediately had like spouts the Jedi platitude of the idea that it's a joy to watch anything transform into the Force, but she quickly recognized that that's not what Osha needs to hear. And then she comes back with one of the best lines in the entire show when she tells her, you know, we're not defined by what we lose, we're defined by what we survive. And I kind of see that almost as a, you know, a thesis statement for the entire series in a way. And Jackie, like, you know, when she reaches out and she puts her hand on Osha's shoulder there, it's, you know, it's a very tender moment between these two. And obviously tragedy, you know, awaits. And one of the great tragedies is, as you said, that line from Kymir after, you know, when he's mocking, you know, like, we're kind of pushing, needling Osha, saying like, where did you think that was going to go? Like, why do you love people who can only go so far, who can't go as deep as you can? And you're like, it's very effective, but you're also like, this is the man who killed her. This is the man who put 3 lightsabers through this 18-year-old girl, and when in front of her horrified master, and when her master, you know, responded with, you know, anguish and pain, tilted his head and said very coldly and, you know, snidely, "Was that its name?" And you're just, and you can feel, and obviously he has, you know, disregard for the Jedi because he views them as a threat to his existence, but you know, that's just cruel. You know, that is a sign that Kymir is ultimately an evil character in many ways. But you know, and it's part of what makes that reveal tremendously effective, because we see Kymir's, you know, brutality and savagery and skill to, you know, cut down 7 Jedi and almost take down Soul before Osha, you know, intervenes. But really what makes him so ruthless and effective is the fact that he is willing to do something like that, where he will end this 18-year-old girl's life through a little bit of devious, underhanded trickery with the lightsaber, just because he can, and because he feels like this is his path, you know, at this point. And I just, you know, it's heartbreaking to lose Jackie in this way. You know, even more like, I was definitely more affected by Jackie's loss than like some of the other losses we had in the series. I know, like, when we'll eventually talk about the character of Yord, people developed a very, you know, understandable attachment to the character of Yord too. I did not consider myself part of the Yord horde, but I
have
liked
run through, you know, the journey with Yord that we're going to talk about, because there have been so many different stages to my evaluation of Yord as a character that it's almost comical. But yeah, no, I just, yeah, it hurt though. I'm not gonna lie, like, because like Logan is just one of my favorite films of all time, and hey, we're talking about it next week. Um, but and so and she was such a breakout star for that movie, and I've been waiting for her to get like, yeah, I know, a lot of people were into the his Dark Materials show, which I've only seen an episode or two. I've never really been that much of a fan of that series of books, so I've felt kind of at arm's length a bit with the TV show, um, but I've been waiting for her to get another role that like would be really, a juicy one for me to watch. And this, like, I was so excited. Oh my God, she's going to be a Jedi. Um, and and even though I'm mad that she died, but she got a really good role in the show. So I'm happy, and I'm kind of crossing my fingers that like in Star Wars books and stuff, there's some more injecting material to be mined, but we'll see. Um, uh, so yeah, um, let's take a pause right here because we're almost an hour and a half in, and let's just do the mid roll real quick. I just gave away what our stream next week will be. Not that it was a surprise, but we will be talking about the X-Men film Logan next week, which I really, even though it wasn't technically the last Fox X-Men film released for me, it does kind of feel like that was uh, the sort of farewell film for that era. And and of course at the time we didn't know we'd be getting more Hugh Jackman as, as Wolverine. But even still, like I'm looking forward to Deadpool and Wolverine, but it's going to be something different because it's going to be in the Disney era MCU. Um, and we will be talking about that film as well the week after. But Logan is always going to hold a special place in my heart because that film feels like the end of an era, and for my money, it's the best Marvel film that's ever been made. Um, and yeah, no, I just Hugh Jackman, Daphne Keane, Patrick Stewart. Oh, jeez, just and the rest of the cast is phenomenal as well. So we're going to talk about that next week, and I haven't yet decided if I'm going to go see Deadpool and Wolverine before or after we talk about the movie because I actually do want to wait for the Tuesday discount movie ticket. But I may not be able to wait either, so we'll see. But either way, the next 2 weeks will be a lot of X-Men stuff before I go on my trip. Um, so yeah, I'll go ahead.
Yeah, I will. I am so looking forward to talking about Logan. It was always one of the when you and I started, our hosting series together, and we were writing down films that like we wanted to discuss eventually. Like this was one of the first films that got put on there because it is a triumph and a beautiful beautiful movie, as well as just a great superhero action film and a character piece. It is my favorite of the X-Men films. It is probably my favorite Marvel movie because I again, not always wanting to do rank lists, but when I did with one of my favorite superhero movies a few years ago, I think Logan was number 2 for me, behind only The Dark Knight. And that's pretty good company to be in. But it's just it's a unique X-Men film, and it feels very appropriate to as kind of the end of not only the unofficial Wolverine trilogy, which had its ups and downs, but also for Hugh Jackman's tenure at the character at that time. And even though he will be returning in Deadpool and Wolverine, it will be, a variant of the character. And from everything I've seen, they fully intend on honoring the sacrifice that version of Wolverine, had, in that movie. Like they are not undoing it by bringing him back. So,
well, I always looked at it always felt like, in a way, its own kind of standalone piece anyway, because like I adore the Fox X-Men franchise, but continuity was not in its bag of tricks. So actually, the MCU multiverse has done me a favor, because now I just get to treat every movie that went its own way with continuity as a variant timeline. But yeah, no, I just adore the movie, and one of the best things about it and its tone and the level of filmmaking craft is that it felt like the X-Men film for the fans who had grown up with that series. And the for the people who, like me, who were younger when the first X-Men film came out, and then were adults when Logan was made, it felt like an appropriately like grown up farewell to the story and to the characters of Logan and Charles. And and we're going to talk a lot in our discussion about the fact that this movie came out and I saw it in the early days of when my mom was having her decline. It hadn't quite taken a firm hold of her yet, hence why we were able to go see the movie, and we were both able to just enjoy it. It wasn't until later that it sort of hit me, the things that were going to be a bit more difficult to watch. And I'm actually thankful that since her passing, I went through a period where I couldn't bring myself to watch it while she was, uh, you know, being taken over by her illness. But since she's passed away, it's actually easier for me to go back and watch it, because I no longer feel like I'm in the middle of the experience, of this movie with what Charles is going through and all that. And so it's actually more cathartic now when I watch it. So we so it'll get a little emotional next week, because I just won't be able to not talk about that stuff. But we're also going to have a lot of fun just talking about a great X-Men film, a great film period. It's again, we all hate ranking, but like out of that whole year, like I this like the only reason this wouldn't have been like my number one film of that year is because, hey, Blade Runner 2049 was out that year also. So like it's just an extraordinary piece of filmmaking. So it's going to be a lot of fun when we talk about it.
yeah, and we will be showering praise not only on Hugh Jackman, but also on Dafne Keen, who is incredible in the movie. It's one of the reasons she got this part. Leslye Headland has very much said, I wanted to see X-23 with a lightsaber, and so she did. But her role in Logan is one of my favorite, child acting performances ever. The fact that she was 11 when she made this is insane. It's one of Patrick Stewart's best performances is Charles Xavier. There's a great supporting cast, including Boyd Holbrook, Richard E. Grant. Great writing and direction from James Mangold. It's just a special movie.
And Boyd Holbrook, we are going to talk about him because, oh my God. And he's like, poor guy. He's basically been playing this role multiple times since then. So, but who can blame the studios for when he does such a great job in this? But like he does kind of play the same role in both Justified Primeval and also The Sandman. But that's okay. So yeah. Anything else you want to mention before we dive back in?
just looking forward to revisiting it, and we'll talk more once we've both had a chance to revisit that and Deadpool and Wolverine. So very good.
Okay, so we are gonna like dive into the wealth of amazing storytelling in the Brendock sequences with the sisterhood and all that, because there's so much of what was so great about the show. I feel like is in those episodes. But first, let's go ahead and talk about Jord. Because or as I liked to call him before the show actually premiered, the guy who just says it doesn't make any sense. It's like every single preview, that's all we got from him. And I was like, oh my God, this guy is annoying me before I even see the show, because he has nothing else to say. Of course, there was much more to the character, but I just found it so hilarious that, like, it's like, come on, guys, you should be able to give him anything else for the trailers.
Well, I mean, he also had the line, "Someone is killing Jedi," you know. So they gave him 2 lines. But you know, from the moment I read Jord's databank entry, because they post the brief databank entries before the show premieres, and one of the lines about Jord was, quote, "His need to be a by-the-book Jedi can cloud his mind." And I immediately thought, oh, this character is going to be frustrating by design. But Charlie Barnett, the actor who plays him, actually managed to find something much more like empathetic in that role. You know, he is very much a stickler for the rules, and sometimes jumps to conclusions, but it all comes from a place of clear like insecurity. You know, this is a guy who clearly like feels he needs to prove himself and justify like the fact that he's now been made a Jedi Knight. And I've heard great discussions about the idea that like a lot of times people who are so focused on their anxieties like that, having rules can be a crutch, because then you don't have to think, you can just do, and like that's one of Jord's first lines in the first episode when he arrives to arrest Osha for ultimately the crime that May committed of killing Master Indara. And she looks at him and is kind of like, "You don't think I did this, do you?" And he just quietly kind of says, "It doesn't matter what I think." And that's kind of like a sad line, because the guy clearly, like, he's part of the Jedi Order. It's an institution that he loves. But he just, he's the kind of character who just feels like his clothes don't fit. Perhaps that's why he takes them off and steams them. And it was an absolutely hilarious scene, and that is obviously what spawned
which is also another reason why I loved Jackie so much.
Yeah,
Jord, your clothes on.
Oh yeah, and that is another, like, a great line. Even before we get to that, was when they're getting ready to board the ship, and Soul's like, "Well, we're going to bring backup," and Jackie's just like, "Is it Jord?" And he's like, "What's wrong with Jord?" And she's just like, "Nothing. He's Jord." Which, again, great line reading from Dafne Keen there too, because clearly, even though she's an apprentice and he's a knight, you can tell that she's just like this fucking guy. Not in a like mean spirited way. She doesn't hate him, but just like she's like, "God, you're ridiculous." And Dafne Keen had talked about the idea that she kind of views Jord as a little bit like useless in that way. But it's an interesting dynamic, but it's also another thing that brings out like the empathy and humanity for, it's like Osha in the early parts of it, because you could tell that like before she left the Order, she knew Jord. They were friends. They grew up, together. They came up together, and now she made the decision to leave the Order, and he is now ascended to knighthood. So there's now a power dynamic there, but he still can't hide the fact that he does still have affection for her, and I love the moment in episode 2 when, after she sneaks off and there's some suspicion could she have killed Torben, he's just like, "No, No, I was watching her the entire time.
Which I was so dreading that moment, because when he goes to follow her, I was like, oh God, he's going to think she did it. So it was actually a nice reversal of that, when actually, no, he's able to back her up.
Yeah.
Which, is great. I like it when, shows and movies play against expectations like that. And it's like, when the difficult person turns out to be supportive, it's nice. No, I will say, like I said, I went through a couple different phases with Yord as a character. Before the show, I was just sick of the fact that I just kept hearing the same damn line from him in every trailer. Then when I was watching the show week to week, I really didn't like him. I was just like, kind of like you were just saying, sort of, Jackie kind of feels like this fucking guy. And he just felt like, oh God. And just the look on his face when OSHA sort of like, hits him, on the side of the arm when he first shows up, and just the way he looks at that, like, how he reacts. He reacts like Haldir from Lord of the Rings. And it's just like, oh, loosen up. And and so I wasn't super fond of him. And then I was aware of the whole, Yord movement online, and I was like, no. But then a funny thing happened going back, rewatching the show, because, in a series where there's so many morally corrupt characters, Yord just isn't.
Yeah.
He is a true Jedi Knight. And, he's by the book, but, but should we really hold that against him? Obi-Wan's by the book too, until Anakin starts to drag him down a bit. I just started to really respect him as a character on my second viewing. And I like the fact that, when Soul says, get OSHA out of here, in episode 5, he follows that order. He's like, we're getting out of here, and he works to really protect OSHA, and and then ultimately sacrifices, himself. And you know what? So I'll say it. My first impressions of the guy were wrong. I think, there was a true Jedi Knight. Not my favorite personality type, but but he earned, he earned his place, in the order, which is more than I can say for some other supporting characters in the show, who we will also get to, who I'm like, what are y'all doing there?
There's one in particular we will talk about. I have a feeling we're talking about the same one.
I've got two in mind, but yeah. So at least he looked like he belonged there, and 2, he actually earned it as well. He was a stand-up guy, even if I rubbed up against him, sort of the wrong way initially. But I ended up liking the character.
Yeah, and he very much embodies a lot of what we will come to see from the Jedi in the. My original impression of him was he's like, oh, this is going to be the Jedi who's kind of like the stand-in for the Jedi who frustrate us in the prequels, like Ki-Adi-Mundi. And lo and behold, guess who shows up in this show? And that was a point of controversy that we will get into. That was one of the
and you told me about that controversy. So, like, yeah, let me. Yeah. I know I had a picture of that he's at least in. The small, which, by the way, and it threw me for a loop that there's a small council, of the Jedi Order at this time. But yeah, I had no idea that that's who this was. I was just like, oh no, hey, it's a Jedi from the same race. But apparently, yes, it is him, and I was thankfully spared from the online discourse of all that, because it's like, yeah, guys, they reset the canon, don't you remember? I know some of you have issues with that, but get over it.
Yep. And his birth date was never established in any canon source. And I know some people were very attached to the fact that apparently Syrians are supposed to only live 60 years and get to have multiple, wives and stuff. But it's okay. It's okay. We can let that go. Like for a minor background character. But it was funny just because before I knew Ki-Adi-Mundi was going to be in the show, there was kind of an interesting, funny, dynamic along the Force Center discourse. Like, wouldn't it be funny if Yord ended up being Ki-Adi-Mundi's master or something? And then when we see they're active at the same time, I'm like, oh, maybe Yord was Ki-Adi-Mundi's Padawan. because they kind of have a similar, approach. But ultimately, I think what makes Yord a much more endearing character is the relationship he has with Osha, and the fact that at the very end when Osha is tells him we have to go back, we have to help our friends, he bends on that moral code, or that inflexible nature. He listens to her, he agrees to go back, he has a heroic moment of trying to stop the stranger, and then he has one of the most brutal death scenes we have ever seen in the Star Wars project. It shocked me, not because I haven't had seen characters have their necks snapped in movies before, but the way that Chimera does it, the way he relishes it when he says surprise, and then he snaps Yord's arm and then grabs both of his hands and then both of his hands on the side of Yord's head and does that violent twist, and you hear the snap.
Well, and I thought it was
Jesus.
And this really only caught me on my second viewing. The sort of parallel between that neck snap and then the way the witches' necks are snapped inadvertently by Indara, in episode 7. Lots of things to make us feel uncomfortable in all this stuff, and it's that, but it felt brutal just because everybody's dying from lightsaber wounds left and right, and then Yord gets his neck snapped. Oh God. So it's an example of a journey I went on with the character, and ultimately ended on a good place.
His heart was in the right place in the end. He was just kind of being driven by his fear and his anxieties, and ultimately he did go back and try to help Osha save everybody. And the tragedy is that moment of finally bending on his kind of moral rigidity is what ultimately cost him his life. I was not a card-carrying member of the Yord Horde, but I do have tremendous empathy towards the character, and I understand why people loved him so much, because for many people there's a little bit of Yord in all of us. And we would hope that
let's be honest, it's just because you're a journalist, it, I know it.
Yes.
No. But maybe. No. Okay, so I mentioned the witches, so let's go ahead and talk into the fascinating world established in episodes 3 and 7. Brendock, which these episodes were so morally complex, and but starting with episode 3, I really loved the way they established the coven and the relationship, especially that Mother Anastasia had with the girls, as well as I really, and I have to say, I feel really bad for Mother Coral as well, especially going back and watching this, because especially since she's the one who carried the girls, and she seems to get the short end of the stick in terms of being allowed to make the decisions of their welfare, which is just bull. and so even though she makes some really bad decisions, as we see in episode 7, they're perfectly understandable. And yeah, but focusing on the good for now, I loved the way everything was established and talking about the thread as like an alternate way of how they experience what's known as the Force, and it really brought me back to The Last Jedi, and also Star Wars Rebels with who's our big guy in that show?
Zeb?
No.
Oh, the Bendu?
The Bendu, yeah. And like this whole idea of the Force being bigger than just the Sith and the Jedi, and that it doesn't just belong to the Jedi, and that it's actually something that different people can view differently, and I think that's what we get, with the Coven, and so I just loved all the stuff of her training, trying to train the girls. Of course, the girls just being girls, young girls, and sort of shoving each other and not paying attention. It's like I haven't personally been a teacher, but I imagine all teachers can probably sympathize with that scene. And then, of course, as we find out in episode 7, Soul, views that moment, with the worst possible timing and draws the wrong conclusions and all that. But no, I just loved it. It was some of my favorite stuff just because, I just thought they did a great job of establishing the world of Brendock and the society, and it was just so sad to see it all come crumbling down.
Yeah, it was a fascinating backdrop for which to set what really was, in many ways, the core mystery of the show. I've talked about how the show was perhaps oversold the mystery element of the mystery thriller, but because ultimately the real mystery wasn't who's killing the Jedi. We knew it was May, and then the Chimera, the Stranger. It was what happened on this planet of Brendock 16 years ago. And there are flashback episodes. They're like kind of isolated from the main story, but they're integral. And really, this, among the many strengths of these 2 episodes, I can really boil it down to 3 words and 1 person: Jodie Turner Smith. She is awesome in this role as Mother Anastasia. She's just strikingly gorgeous. I have to say that she's just one of the most beautiful women I've ever seen.
Yeah, earlier I said that Manny Jacinto was like the MVP of the show, but I think just as much so Jodie Turner Smith. She's in less of it, but has no less of an impact. She's just like, and I'm trying to think, like, I know her as an actress, but like I don't remember what I've seen her in before. But she just like, but now she'll always be Mother Anastasia to me, because she was just so utterly amazing. And like, it's and she was just such a presence that I'm like, don't screw with this Coven, even though they meet a bad end, obviously. But but it very much created the impression of these witches are a force to be reckoned with, and a lot of that I feel like laid on her shoulders, like sort of establishing all that, and she was just such a warm, loving presence. For the girls.
If you want a recommendation for a movie that Jodie Turner Smith is great in, Queen and Slim, where she stars alongside Daniel Kaluuya. That was my introduction to her, and she is great in that movie. And she's great in this role because, exactly as you said, she is so warm and kind and empathetic and loves her daughters, more than anything, more frankly than her, responsibilities as the leader of the coven. She ultimately chooses motherhood over like forcing a destiny on one of her daughters that she perhaps doesn't want. But she's also incredibly formidable, and we see that in both the episode 3 in the training sequence and the kind of the way that she, stares down the Jedi. But then also more so in episode 7, like the possession scene with Torben, where she is alluring but also terrifying, and in her seductive power and the way she.
Yeah, I was like, I feel like, I felt a bit uncomfortable about making this assertion, but I'm like, there's some seduction stuff going on there, right? Like there's that element to it, but also it's like, and I know this isn't the most, the sort of greatest thing to say because it's sort of overused as a trope in cinema, but that whole thing of I don't know whether I'm frightened or aroused, that type of thing. But what can I say? But no, she is fearsome in that scene, and it's like, okay, yeah, and I just loved the entire thing of, we're presented with that in episode 3 from the outside perspective, and then getting to really get inside Torben's head in episode 7 and see what was going on. It's just, I just loved how all that was done. Sort of what exactly we weren't privy to initially, and then the way all that comes out later on. Yeah, I thought it was really well done, and yeah, again, like she had that really sums up her whole character, like the fact that there was the warm, caring, mothering side, there was the seductive side, and then there's the, oh shit, I don't want to mess with this lady because she's really terrifying and will, destroy me. Side, and it's not an easy thing to convey all of those qualities, and yeah, no, she was just phenomenal.
Yeah, no, and she manages to feel both very grounded and very otherworldly, as a witch coven leader should. I thought her performance was one of the best in the series, and I frankly think that like she gets some of the best moments, and the story almost doesn't work without her, and because ultimately like you can feel the absolute love that both Osha and May have for their mother, even though Osha is conflicted about wanting to do the ascension ceremony. She still loves her mother dearly, and she loves her family, and May obviously worships the ground her mother walks on. But it's just it's she's an essential touchstone, and ultimately the fact that she is so essential, the reason it's her loss that is the catalyst for all the terrible events that follow. But I particularly love the scene where she's talking to young Osha, after Osha has been tested and passed the test after being instructed to fail, and she is talking about the fact that she wants to leave, she wants to become a Jedi, and Mother Anastasia sends everyone away, Coral, May, the rest of the coven, and she just sits down and has a heart-to-heart with her daughter. And the line in particular that I really want to highlight is when she says, destiny is not decided for us by an anonymous force. If you want to pull the thread and change everything, then pull it. And in the trailer, that line seemed a little bit more ominous. Here, it really is exactly as it's framed. It is a mother lovingly trying to, pass this knowledge on to her daughter about what it means to make this choice. And when Osha asks, if I go to be with the Jedi, will I ever see you again? She just kind of smiles sadly and shakes her head and says, you won't. And you're just like, oh my God, Jodie Turner-Smith again. What a phenomenal
And just
performance.
well, and then just let's parallel that with Anakin. You know, will I ever see you again? And
What does your heart tell you?
What does your heart tell you? I don't know. I hope so. I guess, and we will see each other again. And so just comparing those two, but then also it ends, you know, equally tragically, because even though he does see her again, you know, it's at her death. So
yeah.
So
but it really can't be overstated just how important it is that, like, Mother Anastasia, even after creating Osha and May for this very specific purpose, using these mysterious, potentially dark side arts, and wanting them to, you know, lead the coven or and through the ascension ceremony.
Well, that's the thing. We don't have a firm answer on exactly what all that entails or what she invoked to create the twins. These are questions posed to be answered. And fingers crossed in a season 2.
And we will definitely talk about that, because there's some fantastic stuff there, and lore, and you know, a certain long-faced Sith Lord might have a little something to do with it. But it's notable that
which,
even
by
after,
the way, I will just say real quick that was one of the moments where I was like, and pardon my language, I was like, holy fucking shit.
Yep, me too. Because I was so hoping for it. But yeah, and it felt good to get that confirmation. But what I loved about this for Mother Anastasia was that even after having created the girls for this special destiny, you know, she is willing to respect her choice and let her go, as painful as it would be to her. And then, you know, these 2 episodes are titled Destiny and Choice, and it really, you know, is reflected on the, you know, the destiny that certain characters feel that they have, both on, you know, this side of the story for Osha and Mother Anastasia and May, but also for Soul, and it's kind of inverted in that way. Because, you know, Soul feels like he's destined to have Osha as his Padawan, whereas ultimately it is a choice that he makes, and May feels destined to lead the coven in through this ascension ceremony, but ultimately she makes a choice to try and stop Osha from leaving, and it's Osha's choice to go with the Jedi. But the events that unfold here really kind of feel almost fated in a way. So it's a fascinating dynamic. But ultimately, as I said, Mother Anastasia is kind of the anchor on which all this hinges, because she is, you know, even though she wants to protect her coven and she has her suspicions of the Jedi, she is very adamant about the idea that we can't use violence. You know, we can't allow this to escalate. And unfortunately, her lover, you know, Coral, is kind of the one who is really not, you know, gonna escalate things. She's the one who's gonna escalate things, understandably so, because she loves her daughters and she doesn't want to, you know, to lose them. But
I'm just cracking up here because I imagine there was a whole conversation about the you know, sort of the relationship here, and I was just comically thinking, this is the part in the history books where it says they were very good friends.
Yes. Very friends with some benefits, you know. But yeah, and shout out to Margarita Lavera, who played.
Oh God,
played
she
Coral.
was just so great, because like she is the quote unquote antagonistic one who's like, you know, pressing for a confrontation with the Jedi, but like it's perfectly understandable. Like, you know, it's all well and good for, like, we don't know exactly what was involved with Anastasia actually bringing life to the girls, but regardless of what was involved, Coral was the one who actually carried them and birthed them. So it's like she is rightfully pissed off that that this is happening, and so you really can't blame her, and especially once the horrible event of Anastaea's death happens, like what happens at that point again, beyond understandable, that she, unleashes all that onto them. Uh, yeah, it's that, and that's sort of, and this is one of the great things about having a conversation about all this, is because I appreciated a lot more about the show on my rewatch. I'm appreciating it more the more that we're talking about it all, because I'm really coming to understand that this isn't just a story about a lot of people making very bad decisions. But it's a story about a lot of people making very bad but really understandable decisions. Which just makes it all so much more tragic and sad and almost inevitable in a way. It's just, and speaking of Anastaea's death, like that is just, and again, like Soul sees so much that he misunderstands, and he brings, let's be honest, some biases too.
Yeah.
And if we sort of take what we know generally about witches in the Star Wars world, they don't always have the best of intentions, and he's coming from a Jedi perspective, and then he sees what he sees out of context, and he does feel that that the girls are in trouble, and it doesn't, and so that leads him ultimately to make sort of a snap decision when he perceives that and he thinks it's Osha instead of May, and he, and Anastasia is doing some freaky witchy disappearing stuff, and making the girl start to disappear, and so he makes a decision in that moment that is a horrible, wrong decision. And it's tragic, and it's going to haunt him for the rest of his life, and it's going to lead to a whole lot of really bad stuff. It's just, it was painful to watch. Just because at that point, like, and that's when all hell breaks loose at that point, because there's no other way for it to go after that happens.
Yeah, and it just, as you said, feels like a tragic series of small misunderstandings that snowballed into this one moment of like a choice that is made that has cataclysmic consequences, and that reverberate for 16 years all the way to the end of the season and the end of Soul's life.
And actually, the fact that Leslye Headland said that Kill Bill was an inspiration makes me think that this is the version of a sequel to Kill Bill that we never saw, because this is, the little girl in the beginning of the first movie who sees, her mother killed by Beatrix, and and then years later comes back to claim revenge. so but we're burying the lead here, because what does all this hell unleash? Only like the most kick-ass Jedi Wookiee fight that we've ever seen. I know I've got a picture. Here we go. Oh my freaking God. And we were waiting for this the whole show. It's like, because when Kelnaka gets killed in, what is it, episode 4?
Yeah.
There is a feeling of like, that's it? That can't be it. No, hell no, it wasn't. Because, oh my God, this is everything we've ever dreamed of. Seeing a Wookiee wielding a lightsaber. Did you freak out like I freaked out when this fight happened?
I was very much looking forward to it because they did end up putting this shot in the trailers, because if you have a Wookiee Jedi lightsaber fight, you're gonna put it in the trailers. That's just the way the marketing works. So I knew that this was coming, and when I saw that Kelnaka
Okay, I must have forgotten it. Yeah, I must have just forgotten it.
I think it's because it was in a TV spot, not a trailer.
Then I didn't see it.
Yeah, but it's but basically once Kelnaka dies in episode 4 off screen, I was very bummed, but I also kind of knew this was coming, and I was very much looking forward to it. And I love the fact that it's so brutal, because Eric's right. That's actually a very important undercurrent of the scene. The fact that we see Kelnaka while he's possessed under the witch's power, maul Torben's face using his claws and take out his eye, and another very brutal scene. But that, for those who have delved into the hardcore lore of Star Wars, you will know that Wookiees basically consider it a moral abomination to use their claws in combat. Even though they're big, fearsome, creatures, they have a very respectful symbiotic relationship with the trees of their home world on Kashyyyk, and they view their claws purely as climbing instruments. And any Wookiee who uses their claws in combat is basically branded what's called a Mad Claw, and exiled from Wookiee culture forever. That's not spelled out in the show, but for those who know, it's kind of becomes another tragic undercurrent, because obviously Kelnaka is not in his right mind when this happens. He is possessed. He's not the one who's actually doing this, but it still has the consequences of he mauls this young kid, and he has to feel terrible about it that it happened, even though he was possessed at the time, that he allowed the witches into his mind. And that's probably one of the many reasons that he exiles himself off on Kofar, is because of his guilt over what happened with this incident. But in the moment, you can just see how how terrifying it is to face a Wookiee Jedi in combat, because we see him have a kind, empathetic relationship with Osha, and we know that he's very handy, and he's a good cook. All respect to Torben not wanting to eat Nuna legs. Never insult a Wookiee's cooking. But when he is taken over, it becomes you can see Sol and Torben, who are both very capable Jedi, are completely overmatched, and he would have killed them if it not been for Indara's intervention. But yeah, as you said, first ever Wookiee lightsaber duel ever on screen. Wookiee Jedi have been kind of a rarity in Star Wars, but this was long awaited, and it did not disappoint.
Yeah, I find Indara's saving of Kelnaka, and then her causing the inadvertent death of the rest of the Coven, just to be one of the most purely horrific and tragic things in this whole sequence, because she is the one just counseling restraint, and that we shouldn't be interfering here, and she tries everything in her power to de-escalate what's going on, and then ultimately she's responsible for the we can talk about who's really responsible, but she does enact the death of the pretty much the rest of the Coven, and it's and just knowing how highly that must weigh on her, and so you see in the very opening of the show, when May kills her, there's a resignation there, and acceptance. Part of her probably feels that this was going to come back to haunt her someday, and she's resigned to that fact, and it's just really sad. But also, it lends a bit of a complicated feeling to when she decides that they're going to conceal the truth, because she does paint that as doing it all for Osha, but there is this small element too of it of you're also saving yourself from some judgment too, which is really uncomfortable to think about. And um, so yeah, it just goes back to the fact that this show made us very uneasy with characters' decisions and the portrayal of the Jedi.
Yeah, layers within layers, and Indara is a great example of that because the series opens with her duel with May, as Eric it points out in the chat, and we see how capable she is, but also like how. And she comes across as a little bit cold, but we also see that she has a very strong moral compass, and ultimately, she dies in that scene because she chooses to save the bartender rather than save herself, and that is, did she know that was going to happen? I kind of think she suspected that it might, and May knew that. That's why she, played that angle. But in particular, like in episode 3, when the Jedi first arrive at the Coven, Indara kind of comes across as the most like stilted and cold of them when she is telling the Coven, we are concerned that you're training children, and you're basically like, is this actually why the Jedi are here? And we ultimately learn that no, it's they're on the planet for a completely different reason, and it's more Soul who is pushing this angle to try and protect the girls, whereas Indara really doesn't want to get involved at all. And that makes it kind of a tragic that she's counseling restraint and trying to give good advice, and ultimately, Torben doesn't listen to her, Soul doesn't listen to her, and it all escalates to the point where she ends up having to participate in this act that leads to the death of the entire, Coven. So she can be a frustrating character, but ultimately you understood that she was the one who was trying to walk the right path. And even that final decision to effectively conceal the truth, it's framed as an act of compassion for Osha. Ultimately, we know that it ends up backfiring because, while it may have been the right decision to not tell Osha in that moment, it would have devastated her and left her even further adrift than she was. Ultimately, that truth did need to come out, and the fact that Indara and Soul, they essentially just sit on this for 16 years. And Torben goes off and takes the Barash vow, and Kelnaka exiles himself. Like, all the Jedi essentially run or bury their responsibility for this incident. And when Indara asks Soul, like, remember why before you do this, ask yourself why you made this choice. That goes for all of them. They all needed to be doing a little bit more inward looking, and really the only one who does in many ways is Torben. In this scene where with a very effective scene where May we see that what Torben has been seeking this entire time is not enlightenment as it seems, but absolution. And
he actually it's really interesting comparing his death with Soul's death, because where Soul says I did the right thing, Torben says we thought we were doing the right thing, and he actually asks for forgiveness, and or at least May says you can get forgiveness from me right here. He takes responsibility for what happened, and he accepts he accepts death calmly, and he seems to be at peace with it, whereas Soul does not, and he comes to a brutal end, at the hand of Osha instead of May. It's all very, very sad and tragic.
Yeah, and I actually have gained fresh appreciation for this scene with Torben and May after having seen the entire series, because we can see ultimately, even though May is on this mission to kill these 4 Jedi, without a weapon, to please her Sith master and become the Acolyte, and it wants revenge. Really, what we actually see she really wants is justice. That is the title of the episode, Revenge/Justice. But this interaction with Torben, who is the only one of the 4 Jedi who actually gives May what she needs, in the sense that he acknowledges it openly that, yes, we made this terrible mistake and hurt you. I'm sorry, and I am willing to atone for my actions and ask for your forgiveness. And we see that actually has an effect on her, because she, even though she would have cut him down had he not done that, she ultimately seems almost moved in a way when he takes the poison, which I have to admit, when I saw him do that, I was like, man, he must have done something really, really terrible to feel this level of guilt. And seeing in episode 7, it's ultimately all the more tragic. Torben was so young at that time, and he was scared and homesick and lonely, and he made a snap decision out of fear, and he felt guilty that he was too weak to block out the witches from his mind. And these are all incredibly understandable things, but it escalated into a tragic conflagration. And so now he feels like he needs to atone for it for 16 years and ultimately take his own life. It's really sad. And I want to credit, Dean Charles Chapman for, of Game of Thrones fame. Poor kid has a tendency for playing, tragic, slightly overwhelmed, young men who end up taking their lives.
Has he made it through a story without dying yet?
I don't know. I mean, I've seen him in Game of Thrones, where he dies twice. Once as Martin Lannister and once as Tommen Baratheon, and he dies in 1917, and he dies in this. So as we said, Boyd Holbrook has his niche. Dean Charles Chapman seemed to have his niche, but I think it was a really strong performance. Although this is just more of an amusing aside. Obviously they cast him primarily so for the younger flashback sequences, because that's where the bulk of his scenes are.
Yeah.
It does mean that, when he's portraying Torben in the modern day, the wig that they give him is pretty bad.
I was going to say, he comes from a similar line as Obi-Wan Kenobi, and the aging very badly. There's some Star Wars characters who age like fine wine, and then others who, man, they really had it rough. But yeah, no. So So let's tackle the last couple scenes of the season. After we talked about Soul's death and and the tragedy of that, which is really emotional and just so sad that Soul couldn't really come to terms with with what he'd done, and following that, Osha kind of accepts that, in her mind, her path, is the dark side. And what I found interesting about what follows, and I know there's some feelings people have had about, May's fate and the whole thing with the memory wipe, but I did feel like there was a bit of foreshadowing there, in that she, earlier on, she, what's it called? She sets Pip back to his factory settings. And it felt like, are they foreshadowing what's happening with her at the end? That she basically gets to start over, from a pretty traumatic experience, but everything after that, she basically has no memory of. Which I don't know how I feel about as a story point, but it does kind of allow, a potentially different path for the character in season 2, and it'll be interesting to see also how Amandla Stenberg plays that.
Yeah.
But yeah, it was a choice. I'm not sure if I like it or not.
Yeah, I had complicated feelings about the memory wipe and it being the end point for May's, story in this season, specifically because, like I do feel Osha has a very complete story in this season. I feel that Soul has a very complete story in this season. Some of the other characters I felt less that way, and May was one in particular because, when they were hiding Osha in the marketing materials, like May seemed like she was going to be our main point of focus, the character we were following most, and she's the first one we see, in the opening scene, and it's really kind of her quest for revenge that kicks off the entire story. And then over the course of the season, she goes on a journey where she, is starting to realize that like she's been doing this because she thought she lost everything, but when she realizes Osha is alive, she has the moment in episode 4 where she realized, actually, no, I don't need to do this anymore. I don't need to, live my entire life for vengeance. I can, live it for my sister, and I will, surrender myself and take the consequences of the actions. And it's unfortunate that she doesn't really get the chance to do that, both because Chimere isn't going to let her. He's going to kill her before she can, out him to the Jedi. And also the fact that, Osha is not in an emotional place to accept her sister at this moment. She still blames her for everything that happened and, hates her for it. But we see in many respects as Osha, drifts more towards the dark over the course of the season, that May kind of drifts a little bit more towards the light. She doesn't fully get there. She doesn't, she definitely doesn't end up with the Jedi, but like as on the Jedi path. But she does have moments like the great moment in the finale when she has finally disarmed Soul and she's given the chance to kill him. And she says, no, I want him to, confess his crimes. I want justice. I want him to face the High Council and tell them what to do. And that felt like a very satisfying end for her story and her character. But obviously, because of everything that happens with Osha, and, she has to kind of, reckon with that and go on the run. And the reconciliation between the two of them is beautiful. And I love the fact that if they were going to do this memory wipe, it is May's choice ultimately to, submit to it, to try and give her sister the life that she believes that she wants. But it's tragic too, because ultimately, in many respects, May had, never, like the events that were the central trauma of her life when she was 8 years old, seeing her mother die, having lived with the guilt of starting the fire, that even if it wasn't the sole reason that everything happened, was a clear element of that inflamed things, no pun intended, made everything worse. And then that's the trauma that she's left with. She essentially regresses to being 8 years old, and like at the end when and that to me felt like if we don't get a season 2 and the character is left there, that doesn't feel like justice for the character to me. So I really do hope that the story continues so that we can see May try to re-find her memories and find out what kind of person she can be in the world, because now she's essentially back. She's going to be Vernet's just going to try to use her to track down Chimere. She's essentially going to be like a pawn in that way. And again, it just, for one of the central two characters of the show, Osha being the other, and the kind of duality of the light and dark, I kind of felt the imbalance that Osha's story felt very complete where May's didn't. But the thing is, it's all the memory wipe part of it. Like the fact that she is her story did feel complete, and then they kind of introduced this new wrinkle. And I do like it that, for instance, Osha, I personally am of the opinion that, if she hadn't agreed to sacrifice herself in that way, I mean, Chimere probably would have killed her because he needs to protect the secret. And one of the tragedies, again, of Osha's arc is I really kind of feel like she's not going off necessarily, even though she feels destined for the dark now, she's not going off to train with Chimere solely because she's just like, oh, I want to go hang out on the island with the hot guy with the biceps and learn dark arts now. She effectively she tells him, you know, let my sister go and I will train with you. She essentially sacrifices herself for May, but then May doesn't really get to enjoy the fruits of that life because of the whole mind wipe thing. So that's why I have complicated.
The one thing that's the one thing that gives me a little bit of solace with the fact that she's kind of reset to after, after the trauma of, losing her families, at least in this version, as far as she's concerned, like, justice has been dealt. Like, she now has the knowledge that the man responsible for her mother's death is dead. And so that potentially puts her on a different, path, even though, yes, I don't like the fact that she's kind of being used by Venestra, but it does open up her character to maybe go in a different direction. And like I said, I really want to see how it's played in season 2. And if she gets her memories back, and then what that ultimately leads to, I just think it's so sad that, like, and there's a question in my mind of, like, not only is she being used by Venestra, but potentially she's being fed a lie, which is deeply ironic because, it was a bit ambiguous to me as to what exactly she was being told by Venestra, because it seems just as likely to me that Venestra is actually telling her exactly what she's telling everybody else, which is that Soul, tried to cover up everything, and he actually murdered all the Jedi because it probably wouldn't do much for keeping the truth a secret if she told May the actual truth. So it seems logical to me that she extended that lie to May as well, which means that another sister has been lied to, and that's her beginning point for this new phase of her life. And I just find that really sad and depressing.
Yeah.
And yeah, so
yeah, my heart was breaking for May in that scene when they're asking her, like, what is the last thing you remember, and she's saying, like, a fire, it destroyed my home.
Hi, Mother Ryan.
Hi. There's a man, he killed my mother, and but she, they're just images now. They have no, and she remembers the trauma of it, but she doesn't have the emotional catharsis that she had obtained when she got Soul to confess, and she doesn't even remember. And the really heartbreaking one, she's like, "There's someone I need to tell, but I can't find her." And you realize that, this is what she has willingly signed up for, to try and protect Osha, but ultimately you get the feeling it's not going to stick, because ultimately this will end in tragedy for all parties involved. And I kind of got the sense that it was the moment when Vernestra realized she didn't even remember Osha, that she's like, okay, well, now I kind of feel like I owe something a little bit more to this girl, and we're going to track down my former Padawan, Chimere, and set this right. But yeah, it's, like I said, I found this ending for May, it's a good place to end it if it's like a season finale. But if this show, for whatever reason, doesn't get a season 2, I'm always going to feel a little bit conflicted.
And I know that's been the thing, but and it feels like people are a bit more grouchy about it in the streaming era because we're so used to. Yes, it's an undeniable truth, but that shows have gotten canceled, without getting resolution. But this has also been true since the dawn of time with TV shows. I don't think that. Sometimes I have moments of weakness where I'm like, oh, God damn it, just make one season of a show so that if they cancel you, it won't matter. But then when I step back, I'm like, no, creators should tell the story they want to tell, and they can't let what ifs or all that sort of dictate that you can't compromise, just because you're scared the show won't get renewed.
Mm-hmm.
And so, it's so it is what it is. I wouldn't have had a season of the Dark Crystal Age of Resistance be any different just because I know it got canceled. I'll complain about it till the end of time, but I wouldn't want them to have done anything different. And so, and to be fair to like Disney and Lucasfilm, like there hasn't been a show yet except for the Book of Boba Fett, but that didn't really have like a major, like that did resolve its story.
Mm-hmm.
Like there hasn't been a show otherwise that like had like a cliffhanger ending and dangling threads that didn't at least get a second season.
Yeah.
So I have faith that at the very least there will be a season 2 of the Acolyte. So, and if there's not, then we'll deal with that, when the time comes. But I don't approach things as like. I think the only exception to this would be with Ahsoka because that was initially presented as a mini-series.
Yeah.
And whereas they should have just said that it was a planned first season. But yeah, so I don't know. I'm going to judge this on the basis of it's a first season. And not get weighed down on, if this is the only one, then, why didn't they just wrap this or that up? Because it's clear to me that this is intended as season 1.
Yeah. And the thing is, this is an era where I perhaps allowed my expectations to run away with me a bit because Leslye Headland had been very upfront in all her preseason interviews that, like, I don't believe in like ending seasons on cliffhangers. I believe you should tell a complete story. And and the thing, and the thing is, like, there are elements in this finale that are a clear setup for, because I think she was right. She did tell a complete story in this season, and there are elements in the finale like Darth Plagueis and the Yoda tease that could be elements of a tease for a season 2. But that didn't feel like, oh, if the show doesn't get a season 2, then like you can connect the dots to the Phantom Menace from here. It was really just May for the most part, where I was just like, this was one of your central 2 characters, and for her story to feel kind of unresolved because of this memory wipe issue, I just had a little bit of pushback against that. If like May had like not had the memory wipe and like gone out on the run, like I wouldn't have felt that way because I felt like she got her emotional catharsis from the earlier scene with Soul and then her reconciliation with Osha. This just kind of added a new wrinkle where I was kind of like, okay, now I kind of do think the show really kind of does need a season 2. And I have faith that we'll get one, but it's also not a guarantee because things have changed a lot in the streaming economics world. And as mentioned, this show was quite expensive. It was the second most expensive Star Wars show after Andor. Andor obviously got a second season, but that was, it had been renewed for that before this whole the kind of the streaming crunch that we're experiencing right now. You're right about Ahsoka. Like if Ahsoka hadn't gotten the season 2, like I felt that show told a complete story, but I also knew that like clearly there's something else going on with like Baylan and Shin on and like obviously the characters are stranded in another galaxy, and I would have felt frustrated. But I also knew as part of the Mandoverse that they could pick that story up in another show if necessary. This doesn't have that same guarantee.
All right. I'm going to pick up what you said about the budget of this show. The fact that apparently it was the second most expensive Star Wars show. Now I'm going to get into criticizing something a little bit. This show did not feel as big as I expected it to, especially since we're tackling a new era of Star Wars. I didn't really feel like it established like the larger world. There were a lot of great, like, in a smaller scale sense, like they really established the areas of the world that they were in. Like I said, I thought they did a great job with everything on Brendock, and and like the characters were great, and the money was on the screen for like the way things were designed. But like to just get like a single establishing shot of Coruscant and then cut into the Jedi Temple, and like there were a lot of things that felt like if you're starting to explore the High Republic age on screen, give me more. Like make it feel bigger and make it feel like this introduction to this new phase of Star Wars. And maybe it feels different for people who came to the High Republic through the books and stuff like that, but for me it just all felt a bit too small for but again, it's like expectations versus what we actually get. This is actually quite an intimate story. But I'm not going to lie. I just wish it felt bigger, and that's why I'm a little surprised to hear that it was the second most expensive Star Wars show, because, and I don't want to make this a comparisons game, but if we look at Andor, that is a show that feels huge.
I'm sorry, you cut out there for a second.
Oh, did I? Oh,
yeah.
Sorry. What's the last thing you heard?
No, you just the fact that this was the second most expensive Star Wars show.
And I don't like to, I don't want to make this all a comparison thing, but like Andor feels huge.
Yeah.
In a way that this didn't. And I would argue, like, if a lot of people have talked about the volume and all that stuff. This was not shot on the volume. But in some ways, I felt like Ahsoka felt bigger to me than this show did. But again, I hate making it a comparisons thing, because we should just treat with the show that we're talking about. But I got to be honest too. I just wish there was a bit more exploring the wider world of this era of the Star Wars galaxy, and we didn't quite get that.
Yeah, and I felt some of those frustrations too. I mean, like obviously they shot on real locations for many of those things, like the island planet where Osha and the Stranger were holed up. Unknown planet, probably Baldemnik from Legends and the Dark Plagueis novel. Like those scenes looked great. And a lot of the scenes on that were shot in the forest on Kofar at night looked really good. There were a couple dynamics, like some of the scenes in place, like some of the other locations didn't feel quite as expansive. And I get what you mean about them, like even though it's a big world trotting adventure, because it's such an intimate story, it didn't feel as big. Definitely not as something like Andor. Frankly, even though people had complaints about the budget of the Obi-Wan Kenobi series, I thought that story seemed like a more epic as well.
And actually that has a lot more location shooting than people pretend that it does. They think everything on Obi-Wan was shot on the volume, and there was
Yep.
actually a bunch of location shooting. But
Yep.
but that's another discussion. Uh, yeah,
No, but
it's so I don't know. It's it's one of those things again. Like that's not what this show was, and so
yeah,
I don't want to. But but just the fact that we went into it knowing that like they talked about shooting with real locations and not on the volume, and so I had sort of in my head built up that it was going to feel more expansive than it did, and when it didn't, I just felt a little let down by that.
yeah, and I mean
But
some of it is just Star Wars TV. Like this is the way things are, and I
yeah,
think the episode lengths played into that as well. Everything on Brendock looked great, I will say. Like I did think that location
yes,
felt very real. Um, but yeah, it's just like I'm not one of those people who's going to be like, if it cost $180 million, where is the money? Why isn't it all on screen? Like, because some of it also went into things like the action choreography, which looked
yes,
outstanding. Um, yeah, it just, as you said, it didn't feel quite as expansive as one may have hoped, but it's ultimately still did feel like a more, like a big enough story to be worthy of like a Star Wars story on the scale. And I also, in particular, love the fact that you know like going back to the roots of loving like pulpy Star Wars, like the fact that we got so many like alien characters and makeup and prosthetics and puppets and things like that. That was another place where the budget went,
yeah,
frankly.
like that. Yeah, that costs money. It's like we want to talk about. I mentioned the size and scope of Andor, but it also, even though there were prosthetics and stuff, there are alien creatures in Andor, and
Yeah.
not just the two you're thinking of, but like in the backgrounds of a lot of
Yeah.
places and stuff. There's a lot of that going on, but less than in most Star Wars, and so the budget was able to be allocated to different places. But this had a lot of that. Like there's a lot of pulp in this Star Wars. So yeah, it's like I said, ultimately, like I get it, and most Star Wars TV is going to be exactly that, Star Wars TV, not a big budget motion picture. And so it may just be one of those things that we kind of have to accept. And there's also the fact that I feel like I was more critical of it because I don't look at it this way, but I know for some people, chronology is everything. But for me, Star Wars begins with Star Wars in 1977. But if you're one of those, people for whom they look at the first story in chronological order, this is not the best starting point for Star Wars because it doesn't introduce the galaxy in a big way. It doesn't, in my opinion, it definitely does not introduce the Jedi in the most compelling way. And that again, like that's really where sort of my issues with the way the Jedi are characterized, like in context as a story about going back to look at this time period. It's perfectly fine because we've had stories of the Jedi being Jedi and all that. But if this is your entrance point into the story, this is not the way I want people being exposed to the Jedi. So that's sort of an issue / non-issue depending on how I look at it. You know, again, a lot of this stuff just feels like depending on your point of view, and and that's why I said before, I'm really glad that we've had this conversation to talk through a lot of the show, because actually I wound up being so much more positive than I
Yeah.
expected to be. I've actually been really glowing about a lot of stuff, and it just
Yeah.
goes to show that that the rewatch was really valuable, and then talking about a lot of the themes and character arcs and all that stuff. It's it's really good because you don't always. I always use as an example my favorite, arguably my favorite Quentin Tarantino film is Kill Bill Volume 2. And I did not care for it at all on my first viewing. I was like, man, what a letdown. And then I saw it on DVD and I was like, oh my God, this is amazing. So it's one of those things where, you know, I'm not saying I had that much of a turnaround with this, but definitely like, for a lot of the reasons that we've discussed, just, you know, the sort of layout of the episodes and, you know, and how episodes were dropped and all that. I think a lot of that prevented me from, you know, being able to get fully invested in the show. And between the rewatch and us talking about it, I'm happy that, you know, I've definitely had some change of heart on a lot of it. So, so that's nice. But before we, you know, sort of, I want to end with us talking about like the final shots, but there's still some other stuff that I've been thinking about that I want to go back and touch on. Well, first of all, now that just reminded me, the number 2. I said we were going to go back and mention the sort of runner-up Jedi. There's the guy at the Jedi Temple in episode 2. Who's just like, you know, he's grabbing the little cane. He's like, stop squirming.
Oh, yeah.
And then he's not a great lookout either.
No, he's not.
At all. It's like the guy you're watching disappears for a moment and you're like, he's gone. And then you go run instead of like just waiting a minute.
Yeah.
Yeah, him and also Venestra's nerdy subordinate, who I got no problem with. I just called him nerdy. I'm a nerd, you know, like, but like we have a certain picture of what the Jedi are, and these guys are not that.
Yeah, I will just be upfront. You know, all due respect to the actor Harry Trevaldwin, who, you know, I'm sure played the role, was cast for this reason and played the role as to the best of his ability. This character of Mog just didn't work for me. From the moment he showed up on screen, I was just like, this guy doesn't feel, something is off here. One of these things is not like the other. This guy, I think maybe they were filming Harry Potter next door, and this guy like wandered into the wrong costume chamber, and they just let him on the set, because I was just like, from the moment I saw him, I'm like, he didn't seem like a Jedi to me. He just didn't. Let alone one who was like important enough and consequential enough to be sending on these very secretive covert missions. He seemed much more like he belonged. He belonged somewhere, hanging out in the Hufflepuff common room, doing charms homework. He didn't work for me. But
Like,
and although I think my frustration more was for him, like in the episode 6, when like they go to the aftermath of the crime scene, and they're surveying all the dead bodies, and Vernestra's asking him to like tell you what he sees, and he's, you know, recounting like, there was a battle, there was an explosion, and then he throws up the idea, you don't think Master Soul could have done this, could you? And the moment he said that, I was like, oh my God, this is what they're going to do. They're going to pin all this on Soul. And I just found that so frustrating. It worked better for me in the finale once we actually saw it put into practice. But I was like, when I was thinking, like, how are the Jedi not going to know, like, the Sith were behind this? I'm like, oh, this is how. And it's this doofus suggesting it, you know, so.
Okay, here's the thing. He's more of a Jocasta Nu Jedi. You know? He belongs in the library.
Yeah.
Like, and I know this sounds harsh, but it's like, I'm not the Jedi you put on the front lines either. You know, like I would absolutely know my place. I'm very much like, I got my head in the books. Like that's where I belong. There's a hierarchy with like sort of suitable Jedi Knights, and like it just, something was off. But I will say that these two guys made me better understand how Haja Estri got away with posing as a Jedi. It's like, oh, so the standard's not that high.
No. Yeah, we don't know what his M count is. Perhaps he's prodigiously talented in many ways, but it didn't come across that way.
I'm being harsh, and I do apologize to the actor.
Yeah.
But it's like, I mean, I've said it. I just didn't really buy it.
Yeah, I mean, like, again, like, I'm not mad about it. I'm not angry about it. I'm not going to make a ranting car video or any of that stuff. But I was just like, every so often there is a character who just doesn't work for you, and for me, this guy was one.
Well, and this has happened a couple times in the Disney era for me. There's the Jedi early on in Obi-Wan Kenobi who's running from the Inquisitors.
Inquisitors, yeah.
I'm like, that doesn't feel like a Jedi. And maybe they're trying to be more democratic behind the scenes with like who's considered a Jedi Knight and like, what does a Jedi look like or act like? But like, I can't help it. Like, a Jedi's got to be like stoic and like respectable, and there's just some of these guys.
Yeah. Yeah. No, I was just like, the fact that like we have, you put this guy up against Qui-Gon Jinn or Luke Skywalker, you're just like, one of these things is not like the other. I'm sorry.
Oh God. Okay. Yeah. All right.
Yeah.
We can ease up on them now.
Yeah.
Seriously.
Again, like, all credit to the actor. He did fine with the role as written. Yeah. It didn't.
Yeah. No. You guys rock. You're in Star Wars. You can lord that over us until the end of time.
Yeah, I did half expect him to shout in that last scene when he was running up to May. I did half expect him to shout Expelliarmus. So I'm just all right. I'm done picking on.
Okay. Okay.
All right.
Let me wait. I know you have the big thing you want to talk about, but let me. Oh God. Okay, Basil. Like, gotta throw in like a minute or two to talk about Basil because I love this guy. He was so great. Like, we were just talking about how, this is a very pulpy Star Wars.
Yeah.
And, and Basil, I feel like, was the perfect example of that. Just so much fun. I loved all the little noises he was making. Yeah, no. Are you, you're being quiet. Are you pro or anti Basil?
I am pro Basil up to a point. There were a couple things that he did in the latter episodes that I didn't really understand, like when he attacks May and then like runs away, and then when he rips out the wires. But
no, but that was so funny. It
was funny. It was funny.
The tag team of him and Pip,
yeah,
like, was just great.
Yeah, I mean, he was, like I said, he was funny, he was cute, he was like a very like, and he's like a cool lore because it's an alien species from Legends, the Tynan. I love the fact that Yord is the only one who can understand him, but then he will just run off on his own, and Yord's like, we need a tracker to track our tracker. So I did find him charming and funny, and I was glad that he was part of the show. I did think that, like, in the finale, I interpreted it when he like rips out the wires as Soul is pursuing May. They took like that he was he thought Soul might be about to like shoot her down and was trying to prevent that because he's just a good guy. But causing the ship to crash, he's
Well,
an
also, I
interesting.
think he was trying to. Soul was being very reckless, also.
Yes.
So I feel like he was trying to stop Soul from being as like, ease up his determination. Maybe he didn't go about it in the best way that had some inadvertent effects, but I think he was trying to stop Soul from just, going on that single-minded pursuit, and because he was fearing for his own safety. As well as also, everybody else's. But no, it's I totally loved him, and like I want him to pop up and in more Star Wars stuff now, or at least if not specifically him, at least other members, of his race. So
yeah. I have a feeling that we have not seen the last of Basil, especially if we get in that Acolyte season 2. And I appreciated the charm factor that he added to the story, especially in like the early parts where he had like where Osha was kind of like trying to figure him out, and she looks over at Jack. He's like, what or is he or it? And she's just like, that's Basil. Why would you not know what Basil is? But yeah, and he was great. And I did like his dynamic with Pip as well. Because they started off with a little bit of a rivalry, but then they ended up, Basil saved Pip. And speaking of like, I thought Pip was a great droid character.
I felt like that was such a tragic end for Pip, that he just gets rebooted back to factory settings. It's like, what the hell?
Yeah, no, I mean, Pip gets a raw deal out of it because like he has such a fun relationship with Osha in the early part of the season, and she loves him. That's like a plot point, that she's takes such good care of him. But then she ends up sacrificing him to stop the stranger in the forest, and then Basil saves him, and he ends up he attacks May because he knows that's May and not Osha. But then, as you say, she resets him to factory settings, and then we get evil Pip, which who turns on Osha.
Which I'm only joking a little bit here. I'm not really like mad about this, but like it was way too easy to reset him.
Oh yeah,
all the way back to factory settings. Like if I was Osha, I would have been scared of doing that by accident.
Yeah. Yep. But he's a handy little guy, though. All the different tools. But yeah, he gets a raw deal because in the end, he gets separated from Osha. He winds up with May, and then he gets it stored in the Jedi evidence locker. Justice for Pip.
Although, like, I'm kind of hoping that like he gets that May gets him back, and that and they're a team. Next
yeah, I think that's likely.
Yeah. God. I actually did really love like in the first episode when Osha goes to try and reach for Pip with the Force. That again, talking about scenes that mirror each other, then mirroring that with the very end with when she is able to use the Force. And she uses it to choke Soul. It's a very dark parallel, but definitely something I picked up on my rewatch. Okay, you ready to talk about it?
Well, there is one other character that we're going to jump to Plagueis. There is one other character I did want to highlight just because I don't want us to forget him, and he is kind of tied into this more political side of the story, which is David Harewood as Senator Rayencourt. Because I really loved that they included this character in this plot line. Because
if anything, I would have liked to see him introduced earlier on.
Oh, I agree too. I think he should have been a more constant present throughout the season because he's only in the finale, but he's great.
And I think it would have actually helped with what I was talking about. I think when he came in the finale, it sort of opened up things a bit more.
Yeah.
And it might have helped with that earlier on.
Yeah, and because like we get that line in the opening episode where Vernestra's talking to Soul about the the murder of Indara, and then they have the line like, if this were to get out, our political enemies could use it against us. And then ultimately we learn that one of these political enemies is Rayencourt, who wants an external review of the Jedi Order because he believes they are a system of unchecked power and masquerading as a religion. And clearly he's ambitious. He may be doing this in part for very selfish reasons. I think he ultimately is, being a politician here and probably doesn't have the greatest motives. But a lot of what he says in this scene actually, it comes across as very, reasonable, because he's basically, when he's saying running a murder investigation without informing the Senate, and there are multiple victims, and you Jedi are trying to essentially control the uncontrollable. And he has the great line where he says, if you're looking up to heroes, you don't have to face what's right in front of you. And that also is a very thematically resonant line for the entire series. But what I really love about this is a direct connection to the prequels and the fall of the Jedi, that we see them getting entangled with the political, arm of the Senate, where they effectively eventually become like generals in the Republic military. And that's not the way it is in the High Republic. I haven't read all the High Republic books, mostly just Phase 1, but it's different. And this is kind of a bridge, and we start to see how and why this happened, because these events, as orchestrated, by Rey and lead to ultimately the Jedi getting placed under external review by the Senate. Rayencourt, gets what he wants. And that you just know that now that door has been opened, and for Nestor kind of, after trying to prevent it, ultimately gives Rayencourt what he needs to cover up a worse truth, the return of the possible Sith. And you're just this is where you start to feel the knell of doom for the Jedi, starting to echo. And I thought it was a really smart inclusion to have this as be part of the series. And if David Harewood, like I said, I'd seen him in a few things like Homeland before. I think he's a really good actor. Yeah. And this for a one episode character, he crushed it.
Yeah, I also wanted to mention that talking about his dialogue, and with talking about when he says what's going to happen one day when one of you snaps, it also brought to mind another piece of dialogue that we didn't really mention, which was in in the previous episode, that Mother Anastasia says, someday those noble intentions you all have will destroy every Jedi in the galaxy. And oh my God. Yep.
Yeah, no, these are the elements that make this show feel, even though it was marketed as a High Republic show, very much like a direct prequel to the prequels. In that way. So, but yeah, I just thought that it was very smart to include this kind of political angle on the story and the events, and resolve it in this way that we can see the threads that will connect directly to the Phantom Menace. Which, speaking of which, we also got the Trade Federation in the first episode, which was a fun inclusion. But yeah, you can just see the threads that are starting to pull. And if anything, I would have liked more of that in the season, with a more consistent presence from Rayencourt.
Yeah, it's I've always pushed against it a little bit, but there's no denying that there's some, somewhat difficult, racial stuff going on with the Trade Federation and the Phantom Menace. I don't think it was intentional to be, problematic, but there's no question that it's raised some eyebrows over the years. So I noticed a more even balanced portrayal of the Trade Federation that was sort of less rooted in, what could be considered, racial stereotypes, but it was really nice seeing the Trade Federation being carried forward into new Star Wars storytelling beyond the prequels and like the Clone Wars, animation. It's vindication for us prequel fans. It's like, yes, the Neimoidians are part of the fabric of Star Wars, and you can't change that. Now we just got to get. I feel that Jar Jar is coming. Either in whether that's the Mandalorian movie or a further season of the Mandalorian or whatever. He's coming, and none of you are going to be able to stop it.
The circle will truly be complete on that day.
Yeah.
When Ahmed Best shares the screen with much like Amandla Stenberg acting opposite herself, when Ahmed Best gets to play both Keller and Beck meeting Jar Jar Binks, I will be happy.
Yeah.
But something else that made me very happy, and we can go to it now, is the big thing. Did you ever hear the tragedy of Darth Plagueis the Wise?
Oh, if you can see him, I tried to brighten up this image a bit. It's still dark, but but yeah, I haven't even read the book. I have it on my Kindle. It's been one of those that I've been wanting to read for years, but you can never forget that image of the Plagueis on the cover, and so when I saw this, I was like, oh, holy shit. And not only because, hey, it's Darth Plagueis, but also because of what that infers about what's really been going on with Chimere. And I like that I read that some people think that they're unconnected and that Plagueis has just been hanging out on the island. It's like, no. Yeah.
If you know Leslye Headland and how big of a fan of many elements of Star Wars Legends she is, then you knew that, like, no, this is deliberate. And like the planet that they're on, they call it the Unknown Planet. Once it was confirmed it was not Octo, it seemed very clear that it was meant to be Baldemnik, which is the planet in the Darth Plagueis novel where Darth Plagueis kills his master, Darth Tenebris, and becomes the Sith Lord. It is an ocean planet with mined veins of cortosis, so with islands. So you're like,
but I will say, like, I mean, I knew it wasn't Octo because, hey, there weren't Porg there. But there were similar, like we had, wildlife there. But I will say, like, I was struck by obviously the parallels to Octo.
Yes.
And obviously the storytelling going on with Chimere and with Osha, very, Rey and Kylo Ren,
And I think that's why Kylo Ren's theme could be heard throughout the show, not that the stranger's going to end up being the first time.
See, no, I'm calling some, like, I'm pleading, like, ignorance on that one because I was listening on my rewatch for Kylo Ren's theme. I didn't hear it.
It's subtle, but it's there, like at the end of episode 5.
Well, okay. I'll listen harder on further viewings, but it wasn't apparent to me, so I'm still putting a question mark over on that one, but we'll see.
Fair.
Hi, Paul.
Hi, Paul.
Yeah, and okay, I'm glad you enjoyed the show. Yeah, our conversation has been a journey because I started off the stream ready to feel like I was going to be a lot more negative than I ended up being. But it's all a journey.
Yes, and it's been a journey to get Darth Plagueis to the screen as well. Because this was an element, I will freely own up to it. From the moment this show was announced, this is something that I was hoping for. That the show might show us, if they were going to show us the Sith of this time, that it might eventually all lead to Darth Plagueis the Wise himself. And ultimately, he's only a cameo in this one very brief scene. But what really made me feel confident as we were getting towards the end that he could still be involved in the show was just the hints that they kept dropping, and with connections to the lore and the central mystery around the girl's origin. And like from the first episode, when the girls have Ocean May have their rhyme, "You're with me and I'm with you, always one but born as two. As above sit the stars and below lies the sea. I give you you and you give me." That immediately triggered my thoughts of like, that sounds a lot like a Force dyad to me. And so I was wondering if they might be going in that direction. But then in episode 3, we had the hammer line where when they're talking about the Jedi, the witches are talking about the Jedi, and Mother Anastasia talks about how she created the girls, and Coral has the line, "And what happens when they learn how you created them?" And the moment that I heard that, I was just like, manipulation of midi-chlorians, creation of life, prolonging of cheating death. Plagueis. He's coming. He's got to be coming. And that only got more pronounced when they started to talk about in episode 7 the idea of the Virgins, and that the girls' midi-chlorians are exactly the same because they may have been one consciousness that was split into two. And I'm like, this has to tie to Plagueis. It just has to. And then it does. And I just but the moment when he shows up in the finale, I literally stood up and pumped my fist and cheered, because I was just so happy. And happy he's so immune, because there was some worry they might change his species, but it's great that they're respecting that from the original Legend story. Obviously there will be some differences, and to me the big central mystery at this point, if going forward in the season 2, is whether or not the girl's origin and the manipulation of the midi-chlorians to create life, did this come from Plagueis and he passed it on to the witches, or did he learn this from the witches and will take their knowledge and for himself and use it going forward? Because there is that moment in the finale when Sol was talking about the Virgins and how the girls were created, and Chimere, who's kind of standing off to the side, kind of like perks up and tilts his head, and he's kind of like, that's interesting. And it's probably because it's like, whether Plagueis is his master or whether he was cast aside or not, he's probably like, this sounds familiar, this sounds like something Darth Plagueis would want to know about. And I have a feeling that if we do get a season 2, that we will get much more of Plagueis and this thread specifically. But it's just such a cool lore connection that I felt like the show had to go there, and it did, and it felt right.
Yeah, I was not expecting it at all, but I was so happy when it did, because for a show that had kind of been built as really exploring the Sith, and this was like the end of the High Republic era, but building up towards the Phantom Menace. It felt like, I knew that Pelagius was part of the conversation, like in the very early days of speculating what the show was going to be about. And, but I had kind of let go of that. I didn't necessarily think that that's what would actually end up being in the show. But then we get this image of, the Sith, master, quote unquote, with dark helmets and all that. So, and even though that didn't necessarily evoke Pelagius, but definitely like that traditional dark Sith iconography and all that, and then it's revealed to be Chimere. It's kind of like, no, not exactly the image of dark scary Sith that I had imagined. So as soon as Pelagius appeared in the finale, I was like, oh yes, here we go. And to be clear, I love Chimere's character, but it just feels like if we're really delving into, if this is a show that's really about the Sith, it feels like you need like to you need to amp it up a bit with who the Sith Master really is, and just this frightening image of Darth Plagueis. It's just like, exactly what this finale needed to tease us with. I actually thought as soon as they introduced him, I thought it was going to play a bigger role in the remainder of the episode, but it ended up just being a tease for the next season, which I'm fine with. But it was just like a holy effing shit! I can't believe what I'm seeing moment. And it did catch me off guard, so I was happy about that.
Yeah, I think it was just enough, because ultimately, Chimere was the prime antagonist for most of the series. We didn't need to have Plagueis step in and overshadow him.
Well, I actually thought it was, when they showed him, I thought it was going to be a whole big, huge plot reversal where Chimere was going to be shown to be the one who was being tested all along, and that he was actually the one who was meant to kill a Jedi without a weapon by enlisting an Acolyte to, and seducing them to do it. So I thought that was the whole kind of angle they were going to do, but it wasn't. It's just a tease for where it's going. But it did send my head spinning for the rest of the episode.
Which is what by design. And the reason I love that we just got this little tease and that he could be a bigger threat down the line is because ultimately the story of Osha and Chimere, as I said, does feel pretty complete with the way that she agrees to become his acolyte. And that was one of the things that in the pre-interviews, Leslye had talked about, like, what is an acolyte? And she's basically like, well, when the Sith apprentice wants to, gain more power and overthrow their master, they may try to, recruit somebody to become their own apprentice, and that person's called an acolyte. And she specifically cited a character like Asajj Ventress, who was in many ways Dooku's acolyte in the Clone Wars era. Well, he was an apprentice to Sidious. And from the moment I heard that, I was like, Chimere is the Sith apprentice, even if he is presenting himself as the master. And there is a master out there, and it's probably going to be a Sith that we know. Could be Tenebrous. It's probably going to be Plagueis. And I'm glad it was Plagueis, because Plagueis holds such this mythic place in Star Wars storytelling, just from that one scene in Revenge of the Sith, and the way that his legacy has further gone on, not only with the Legends book, but then the fact that Palpatine continues his master's work, trying to live forever, and that extends all the way to the sequel trilogy. And he always felt like a character that at a certain point had to appear on screen, and this was the time to do it. And all the hints that were dropped throughout the show, as I mentioned, about the power to create life, using the Force, it just felt natural and earned. And in particular, what I love is that going forward, Plagueis kind of gets to be like the shadow of doom hanging over everything, because we know ultimately that this is kind of a bittersweet triumph for Chimere and for Osha, that they've now, pledged themselves to the dark side and each other. But ultimately, those final moments, there is still a shroud of doom, because we know in the end, Plagueis survives, and this all leads to Palpatine. So, the tragedy of the Sith and the lie of the dark side will be perpetuated, because if Chimere's intention is to train Osha to, become his acolyte and then try to overthrow his master, he fails. And that probably doesn't work out well for both of them. And maybe he's already been cast aside by Plagueis. We don't know. But I tend to think he is still the active apprentice to Plagueis at this time. But, Plagueis will suffer no rivals at this point. And so Osha and Chimere's, dark side love story is going to have a tragic ending, as it probably should.
Oh, but this looks so idealistic and happy.
Yeah.
Which, it is sort of brilliant that this sort of inverts the traditional, Star Wars ending shot, though this is not the actual ending shot of the episode, but it definitely calls to mind. So it's all part of inversing that, the usual imagery that we get of the heroes. Um, and really, like, I would argue that Osha is still like, and that's sort of the brilliant thing about this is Osha still feels like, our, if not our hero of the story, at least our, the protagonist and the one that we follow, the character we're emotionally invested in. So, and that ultimately is what makes the storytelling so effective. But the actual final shot that we get, this guy, which that looks like a puppet to me. Does it look like a puppet to you?
It does look like a puppet to me. I do. I wonder if it's the Phantom Menace puppet with the weird green eyes that I was never really the biggest fan of.
I don't
the Last
think
Jedi
so.
puppet.
I don't think so because because the official version of Phantom Menace now has the redone CGI version. So this will be either the Last Jedi puppet or something, or a puppet that's close to the sort of accepted version of Yoda. But I will always hold a place in my heart for the Phantom Menace puppet because it was there in '99, and and let's just say the version I still watch today has it. So but no, it'd be great to see the puppet Yoda in this context. But puppet or CGI, I'm just happy to see him, and if he's not, I mean, I don't know how much we'll get of him in season 2, but I hope it's more than a little.
And I think, like, with a legacy character as beloved as Yoda, you do have to, if you're going to use him, you have to use him sparingly. But I do think that this always felt inevitable as well. Like, Leslye Headland was, when she was giving her press interviews, and me like, oh no, Vernestra's the only known character that we know, and we aren't going to have any characters, show up. It's all new characters. I was kind of like, sure. And ultimately, we not only got Yoda, we got Kiadi-Mundi and Darth friggin' Plagueis.
And by the way, Jon Snow is dead.
Yeah. Well, I mean, technically, if you go to the books and like, he's been dead for 13 freaking years, but but yes, in the show world, which is.
By the way, did you guys know it's been 13 years since George R. R. Martin last released, a Song of Ice and Fire book? Just so you know.
Just so you know, and I got a feeling we're gonna be tacking a few more numbers onto that one, if ever. Let it go, people. Watch the show.
I think we had everybody on our side with this stream thus far, and now we've just alienated people.
You know what? We're punchy. It's been 3.5 hours. Keep talking about that.
Which I have to say, this was a lot longer than I expected to be talking about this one. So I'm actually very happy because I've had a lot of fun discussing this, and it's enriched my appreciation for the series. Doesn't take away like the issues I outlined with some of which had to do with the show, some of which didn't. The sort of, I would have liked a more expansive feel for the show. I will say that we talked about Soul a lot. And a lot of this is just sort of my own thing that's like I had to catch myself in some regards. I had a little bit of difficulty on initial viewings of episodes of this show because, the actor plays Saul, he was just learning to speak English for this. And there were times when I was watching it got a little, for me, a little in the way of the character, but also I need to I also caught myself in the sense that we need to be open to actors who and realize that if it's a stumbling block that they don't speak perfect English, that's sort of part of our training. That's, a lot of us have gotten used to, like, you know, actors speaking perfect English in movies and TV shows, and that's a bit insular. And I know a lot of people had, that issue with what's the character's name in House of the Dragon?
Miss Missaria.
Missaria. Whereas for me, I've loved her character, and a lot of people were not very charitable with the accent that they were tackling. That's a different situation because that's an accent that they created for the part. But it's the same. It's a similar kind of thing where I had to sort of recognize, like, my own sort of things that I was bringing into watching the show. But regardless of, like, my feelings of, like, uh, you know, uh, you know, the way the actor spoke and whatnot, like the performance. If you just look emotionally with what he's doing, it's just so amazing. And I think you mentioned this on the line, that just the fact that that this was his first, English speaking role, and he was learning the language. The fact that he nailed so many of those emotions while tackling that, and it's amazing, because at the end of the day, he really did deliver a very affecting performance for a difficult character, because we have a lot of complex feelings about Soul, and some of them good, some of them not very good, and so at the end of the day, I think he did a really great job, um, and part of it may just be because when he first appeared, I read him as like a Qui-Gon type, and then he ended up being a lot more, uh, sort of letting me down in that regard, intentionally so, uh, and so that was kind of a bummer for me, and but yeah, so. Uh, So yeah, I guess the whole reason I was saying it was because I did kind of, I think I struggled with him initially, for reasons that I kind of had to accept and get over that part of myself, because I like I said, I think it's sort of innate that we Americans may watch something and expect everybody to have a perfect, English accent, and that's not always the case. And sometimes, we have to recognize that that's our hang up, but not, any fault of the actor. And I don't like that was something that registered in my head, but I want to sort of acknowledge that, and, and just say that I did, sort of move past that, and I recognized just what a great job he did, and yeah, so
Yeah.
yeah.
Yeah, well, we Jung-jae, the actor, legendary actor in Korea,
Which I love that they call him JJ in
JJ.
the
Yeah,
behind
yeah,
the scenes
I
stuff.
do too.
Yeah.
And he's been so charming in all the behind the scenes interviews and stuff. But yeah, on screen, English is not his first language. This is his first English role. There may have been some moments where that was apparent, but God, the man's a good actor, and emotion is the universal human language. And there are certain scenes, certain moments, like in episode 6, when he goes to reset the transceiver and is just kind of overwhelmed with the grief of having lost, his entire team, and you see him like slam his hand down and like hang his head. I was just like, he's great in this role.
Oh, the part that really hit me when I was rewatching the show was during his fight with Chimera, and when he says, uh, how can a master not show, his pupil, his real face, or something like that. And when Chimere says, "You tell me,"
Yeah.
oh man. And yeah, it's that again. I want to stress, like, you know, my own personal, like, hangups that I just stress this. One thing that was never in doubt for me was like that the emotion that he conveyed in his performance was just like, yeah, that moment you mentioned when, you know, and just the frustration on his face, and you know, when he slams down his foot, like, so good. And he just conveyed this, like, the uneasiness that we feel later on as the truth comes out, uh, is only so affecting because earlier on in the show we have such affection towards his character because he feels like such a warm, caring presence, which he is. You know,
Yes.
it's um, and um, you know, and going back to, you know, the character of Jackie a little bit, I loved his dynamic with her. You know, the aforementioned, you know, your dialogue was fun, but also I love the part where she comes up to him and says, you know, why are you looking at a hologram of your former Padawan? You know, this, you know, sort of nostalgia, you know, promotes sentimentality, and then he intercuts and says, if we don't meditate, you know, on the mistakes of our past, and then she finishes, we're doomed to repeat them. You know, I just thought they had a great dynamic between the two of them. And yeah, no, it's like, again, it's just such a gut punch because he feels like that Qui-Gon archetype,
Mhm.
and then unfortunately he's much more flawed than that,
Yeah.
and you know, it breaks the heart.
Yeah. Ultimately, like the what we've talked about, some elements of the show that like we were conflicted about. One thing I was never conflicted about was the strength of the two lead performances in Jung-jae as Soul, and Amandla Stenberg as Osha and May, because I just like I've loved Amandla Stenberg as an actress for many years, and I should note she does identify as non-binary, uses both uh, uh, she, her, and they, them pronouns, but I think I'm referring to female because she is that's the character in the show. But I, one performance of hers that I have always loved, if you ever get a chance to watch it, watch The Hate You Give. She is outstanding
Okay.
in that movie. It's some heavy subject matter. It deals with police violence, but it's a great movie, and she's great in it. And what ultimately why this show was a success for me, even though there were elements that went up and down, is I really just bought the intensity of the duality of her character and the complexities of her performance, whether she was acting against herself or acting against Soul as both Osha and May, but in particular, the dynamic between Osha and Soul, I think, was the heart of the show. And the great tragedy is that over the course of the story, that relationship breaks and ends in the worst possible way it could because of a lie that was told 16 years ago. Um, and those moments, both with Soul as playing when like he's also great with the younger actresses, we should say too, Lauren and Leah Brady, who play the younger versions of Osha and May. Like there's that scene at the end where of episode we see it in 3 and 7, but when he starts to tell them the lot like about the fire that May started. And in episode 3, he gets to tell the entire story, and you can just see the compassion he has for this poor girl, even though we eventually learn he's lying to her. And I love that at the end of episode 7, it just ends with him, like them cutting off right there and him saying quietly, May started a fire. And then we know the rest because we've seen the rest, but it's just that moment just really hit me. And everything in the finale, it was just there was a reason that scene like left such an impact on me when Osha is strangling him and killing him, and the way she spits out "stop talking," and he is choking and dying, but ultimately, like as you said, he says it's okay, because he has accepted that, this is what is going to happen now and this is what needs to happen, but doesn't make it any less heartbreaking. The way the tear rolls down his cheek, the way she collapses at the end in like grief and sobs, like it felt very emotionally raw and earned, and all credit to the performances, Amandla and Jung-jae for that. So I just thought it worked really well.
I just want to make a quick comment on, as you mentioned, Amandla Stenberg does identify as non-binary. I had looked up when we started talking about, the performance, and it seemed like, her pronouns were both, she, her, and they, them. Doesn't seem like she has a preference one way or the other. So I went about, continuing to refer her that way. I hope I didn't, offend anybody. But it seemed to me that was a sort of either or, an either or choice for her or them. So certainly no. And no offense was meant in either case, but yeah, just to recognize her, she is non-binary. So
yeah, and I really feel like we should emphasize that, because we've talked about the show and we've talked about the characters and the themes, because that is what we are focused on. That is what we are interested in. We've done it for 3 hours and 40 minutes, and it's been great. It bears acknowledging that like a lot of the backlash that this show faced was due to the fact that it was created by a lesbian woman, and there were characters who were of different racial backgrounds and different sexual orientations, or actors, I should say, playing those characters on screen, including Rebecca Henderson, Leslie's wife, and Amandla as the lead of the show, a Black non-binary actor. As the lead, she suffered some terrible racist backlash, and she actually responded to that in this. She released a song called "Discourse," kind of clapping back at the idiots who were spewing this stuff towards her, and it's great. Go watch it if you haven't seen it. But it really is a monumental thing that like a Black non-binary actress was the lead of a Star Wars show. And she crushed it, in the dual role, and that's not the most important thing about her performance and her presence, but it's a very welcome one, and she's always going to be part of the Star Wars family now. One of the things that made me happiest in the promotional lead up to the show was Amandla has made no secret about the fact that she loves the prequels. Revenge of the Sith is her favorite, and she loves Hayden Christensen. And there was a video that they put out where Hayden recorded a message for her, welcoming her to the Star Wars family, and the way that she just screamed in delight and was clearly so emotionally moved. I haven't forgotten that, and I'm very happy that even though I do have some complicated feelings on the show, but even if I hadn't liked the show as much as I did, I would have been happy that, we got a show like this in 2024 where, Amandla Stenberg got to be the lead of a Star Wars show, the titular Acolyte, and very proud of that.
Yeah, and just to be clear, and maybe it seems like I'm going a little overboard with this, but I really want to make sure we're being responsible and respectful. I'm looking at numerous articles, and it seems like every other article alternates between whether it's they refer to her as they or she. So it seems like I can't say for certain, but it seems like she's comfortable with either. But yeah, like I said, we just want to make sure we're being respectful, and because I will say that I want to reiterate again that she just blew me away with her performance in this, utterly amazing, and it's heartbreaking to see that I didn't see much of it because I was staying away from all of it. But if there was that predictable vitriol, which it seems there was, shame on every single one of them, because and even if she hadn't been out of this world phenomenal, uh, it still would have been appalling treatment, on their part, and so yeah, there's no room for that, and uh, Amandla deserves better. The Star Wars fandom deserves better, and yeah.
Yeah, somber note, but it had to be acknowledged that this show has faced that in the world, and we should be better than this. Many of us try to be. Some people are happy not to be, and it's sad that 25 years after the Phantom Menace, we're still dealing with crap like this. But it's a reality. We have to acknowledge it. It doesn't mean we have to condone it. In fact, we can condemn it.
But I will say there really is nothing like letting go of all that noise and just enjoying the show on your own. Because even though I had my issues enjoying the show while it was on the air, it still was a million times better for not having subjected myself to all the social media discourse.
Yeah.
Except for the occasional checking in on the Force Center Discord, which I'm always happy to do, because even though there were some definitely seems to be some complicated feelings on there as well, but at least everybody's respectful, there. So, yeah. So I guess that just about wraps it up. Wow, we went 3 hours and 45 minutes on this one. There's no stopping us.
We were covering 8 episodes.
Yeah. Any before we just recap what we're doing in the next couple weeks, was there anything that you didn't touch on that you want to mention real quick?
I'm sure there was, but ultimately what I'll just say is, while this Star Wars project challenged me more than some of many of the stories in this universe that I love, unambiguously, ultimately I did land at a place of love for it. And some of the things that made me uncomfortable about the show, namely the dark side, focus, and the fact is that we allude to, like, the iconography at the end, like, of our two characters who are essentially dark side acolytes, apprentices, and murderers, are now getting the hero shot at the end. That was the design of the show, and I do have to acknowledge and reckon with that. And in that respect, I think it was executed very well. There were some elements of execution that I didn't think were worked out quite as well. We talked about those. But ultimately, I do think that this was a very successful Star Wars show, one that I am going to enjoy rewatching and revisiting, and accepting it as part of the lore and of the Star Wars galaxy going forward. And I loved so many elements of it. It's not going to be my favorite Star Wars show. Obi-Wan and Andor still kind of have that banner for me, but there's so much here. There's so much richness and thematic depth and character, emotional drama. And really, that's all I can ask for, because this show was incredibly ambitious. It took some big swings, connected on some of them, like 500-yard homers. Sometimes it missed, but this is what I want Star Wars to take, big swings like this. And I hope that the show will continue onto a season 2, so we can get more of this particular story and more of Darth Plagueis. But ultimately, like, I feel that the process of loving an ongoing franchise like Star Wars means that, like, at the Star Wars buffet, as we like to say, there will be some things that are for certain people, some things for some people will prefer other things. Ultimately, the idea is that there should be something for everyone, and for some people this will be their favorite Star Wars, and for some people it will not. I fall somewhere in the middle. but ultimately I do love the show. I'm glad it exists, and it deserves its place in the pantheon of Star Wars, ongoing storytelling.
Yeah, I will say that, like, we had a long discussion about the show, and for people who maybe people from Force Center who just read my one comment that I made in there about how the show just didn't work for me and I didn't feel connected to it, would probably be surprised by the number of positive things that I had to say about a lot of it. But the interesting thing is, like, there's so much in the show that, especially upon rewatch and reflection, that is really interesting. Things that were very well done, performances that were great, but also there is this feeling that it didn't quite feel like the Star Wars that I was used to, and maybe that's part of what caused a disconnect as I was watching it. That's not necessarily a bad thing. In fact, a lot of people would say that's a really good thing. But also, I think that there's too much negativity put on the familiar. You know, nostalgia is not always a bad thing. And I'm just going to be honest. For many years, the Star Wars that I have loved the most, and probably it's still true, is that sweet spot of the Filoni verse that exists with Clone Wars, Rebels, Bad Batch, Ahsoka. That I think that for me is like my comfort zone of Star Wars and what I've come to really love the most about the franchise. And because there's just something that has really spoke to me about those characters, about that chapter of the universe, even though it spans a bit of time in of itself. Um, and so, like, but then there's something like Andor, which just was so out of this world amazing that, like, I can't help but place it as my number one of the live action shows. I think Ahsoka probably comes after that for me, just because it's, Filoni wrote it. It's about Ahsoka. It's about Sabine. It's got that Kevin Kiner soundtrack, which is one of the Star Wars soundtracks I've gone back to the most. I think it's just that end credit piece for that show is just so great. And so that for me is Star Wars, and so I like being in that zone. And so to go into a show like this that is removed from that, there's some things that you can see how they'll lead up to that era, but it's very much unique and different. And so I think I probably had some like trouble adjusting to that. But the interesting thing is that I felt closer to it on that second viewing because, because I had gotten over that initial like shock of, ooh, this is new, this is different, I don't know how I feel about this, to then on the second viewing, I was more familiar with it. So yeah, it taught me to, maybe open my heart up a little bit to something a little different, but also that I have my favorite areas of the Star Wars galaxy too.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah.
So yeah.
And for me, like it's all Star Wars is always going to be most at home for me on the big screen. I miss the movies. I won't deny it. Like all the Skywalker saga movies, especially like Empire Strikes Back, Revenge of the Sith, Rise of Skywalker, but all of them. And like, I think that I have had some adjustments to Star Wars, having primarily been a TV medium in the these past few years, less so on the animated side, more so on the live action side. But like, I think they've hit some home runs with like Andor and Obi-Wan Kenobi, and this show again. I found it a very ambitious swing, and I think that it did a lot to try to expand the palette of Star Wars, and I'm glad that it did so because that's a worthy goal.
Yeah, you mentioned that about the animation. As we mentioned before, animation really has no guardrails. They can, go as far as they want to in terms of ambition. Uh, that's the beauty of animation. Um, so, speaking of which, it seems like signs are pointing towards we are going to get another animated series, if the rumor mill is to be believed. So I'm anxious to find out what that is. So we'll see. Um, so yeah, and so that wraps it up for this discussion. Just once again, next week we'll be diving into the 2017 James Mangold film Logan, one of my favorite films. And I wonder if people get tired of me saying that, because pretty much everything's one of my favorite films. Um, and then the week after that, we'll be tackling Deadpool and Wolverine. So yeah. Any closing remarks, Jared?
No, just very happy that we spent so much time on this show, gave it the investigation that that it deserved, and hopefully learned a few things along the way. And I will just, I don't have a witty closing line unless we want to, recite the rhyme again, or just say, the power of one, the power of two, the power of many. I think that we can just leave it there.
Oh wait, no. I got. God, I hate to end on a negative. I won't. I'll end on a positive, but first a little negative. Was not a fan of the ending music for the credits of episode
yeah.
7. I am not one of those who wants to hear, a sort of modern pop song over Star Wars end credits. Like, it needs to be John Williams flavored, or at least that sort of classic, orchestral approach. Um, or just something instrumental, something that feels like it's in the ballpark. I will say that the end credits for episode 8 I thought were extremely powerful when they were doing the power of one, power of two chant from the witch's coven. I thought that actually was really effective. So that'll be my positive note to end on. but yeah, actually, we didn't. That may be like our only mention of the music. We didn't.
Yeah,
that was like our one blind spot in this discussion.
Michael Abels composed the score for this show. I did a very good job, as all the Star Wars composers do. I think the reason I didn't touch on the music as much is I haven't had a chance to listen to the soundtrack independently, and the music didn't stand out quite as much for me as some of the other Star Wars shows have, but it was still very strong work.
I thought it did good at establishing the overall, except for the aforementioned song at the end of episode 7, but elsewise it did establish that sort of John Williams style of music. I thought that, like I said, the witches' chants were really effective, but it didn't necessarily speak to me in terms of overall themes that really stuck in my head. So I didn't dislike the score, but it wasn't necessarily one of the ones that really stayed with me either. But that said, I had a much greater appreciation for it on a second viewing, and maybe it's just about taking a listen to the score on its own. But yeah, at the very least, I will say it really felt like it paid tribute to that sort of Williams style of scoring, and like it's and sometimes these days, like, the aim of a score is to propel the drama forward, and I thought it did a great job at that. So yeah, but I look forward to listening to it a bit more, in the future, and gleaming a bit more from it. But I'm glad at least we said a couple words about it, because that was very uncharacteristic of me.
Lots of other stuff to talk about.
Yeah. Okay. Well, I figure we could get that in because we were close enough to the 4-hour mark anyway.
Yeah.
So, but let's get it in under 4 hours.
Yeah, let's do it.
Yeah. All right. It was great hanging with you guys tonight. Thank you, everybody who chatted with us, and we will see you next week. Until then, may the force be with you.
Always.